Outside a certain building in the city, some people gathered to invade the place. Quickly, they entered the building and started running through the corridors in search of what they came to find. Suddenly, the leader of the men arrived at the area where the largest number of people were concentrated, and some scientists became desperate as it was the hunter Hong Seokyang. As a way of informing her leader, one of the intruding women pointed to a door, indicating that there were children trapped inside. They quickly broke the glass of the study center to free these people. In this case, they asked if the children were okay, but among them, there was one who showed no reaction, unlike his colleagues. With a smile on his face, the leader of the group said that now everyone was free, and meanwhile, the hunters in the background decided to check on their condition. According to the mysterious boy from earlier in Hong's arms, he asked if the boy was hurt anywhere on his body. In his view, the boy realized his situation where all the scientists who had kept him captive were now being subdued. At this moment in the boy's mind, he could only think about the expression of the arrogant leader who was now begging for his life on the ground. The hunter asked the little boy what his name was, but he initially did not understand what he meant by that. In such a case, he thought about what he would have to do to drive this man crazy, cheerfully responding that he was number 12. Hong, on the other hand, was a little confused and decided to put the boy down. Then he kicked the scientist responsible for the boy's creation, calling him a damned bastard. Seeing that situation, the boy believed that power was necessary, an overwhelming power to which no one would have a choice but to submit. Suddenly, a piercing voice called for the hunter. It was the inspector who reprimanded him for doing something indecent again, asking him to stop the action. Thanking for the help, she informed him that although his actions were well-intentioned, they hindered her work. Intervening in the conversation, the boy asked if the girl was the hunter's boss. Informing the boy, the woman said she was only the one who reprimanded him. So the boy questioned if that wasn't being a boss because the lab's head always reprimanded others and also hated them. In this case, showing immense fury, the inspector said she would make sure to punish that bad scientist. The boy innocently commented that the woman seemed too weak to be a hunter, and the girl confirmed she was not a hunter and much less strong, but advised that one should not judge a book by its cover, because in the end there are many ways to reprimand a person besides beating them as Hong does. So the boy asked what he would have to do to become someone like her. She stated that the boy needed to study a lot and pass a nationwide exam, then work hard after passing to move up in rank. Discovering the overwhelming power of a hunter and different kind of power that labeled the hunter, this became the moment that decided the boy's life path. 19 years later, on May 31, 2044, at the Jeon District Skills Management Agency in Seoul, South Korea. Now grown up, the boy reported that Dungeon 2 in Yanggeonpo and Dungeon 1 in Inwang Mountain reached level 2 threats that day. Facing people's reactions, the man thought a little disappointed that these bastards never improve. Annoyed, the boy asked if his colleagues wouldn't listen to him because even though the dungeons were ranked B and C, their interiors were unstable. Thus, they had the capacity to show immense danger, so it was wise for the hunters to listen to him to minimize mission risks. Putting aside these trivial matters, it was informed that Team Z would be in command of the B2 ranked dungeon in Yangdeonpo. With no complaints about it, Team 1 would handle the Titan dungeon, and Teams 3 and 4 would be out as they were resting. In this case, another guild would take care of the dungeon in Inwang Mountain. Finally, all the equipment had been prepared, and they were asked to check everything before entering. With no more questions after lunch, Team 2 should be prepared, so after the warnings, they casually went to lunch. With the other members gone, the boy asked what worried the hunter Yu Jiun. Then you said she wanted to know about the dungeon he mentioned earlier. In this case, it was informed that Banjidong was a D6 classification dungeon, and only people were sent to dungeons with a threat level equal to or higher than the second. The hunter said he just had a bad feeling about it, and the boy explained that if they closed a dungeon based solely on feelings, they would be attacked by the media. With a disappointed look, the boy says that the hunter shouldn't abuse his powers as an S rank, and irritated, he replies that it's the boy who is abusing. Furious at the man's mockery, you say she would have fired him if it weren't for his excellent work, and the boy warns that if a hunter attacks a public official, it's terrible. Putting everything aside and now speaking seriously, he really warns that she has a bad feeling about this matter. However, the employee simply leaves, saying he doesn't have any more service hours in his contract. He also asks not to be hired again. Moreover, he comments excitedly that you won't be able to contact him anyway if he's in the dungeon. Days later in Busan, it is asked if this is the watch that was on the news. The boy responds that it is a masterpiece created by the government and the SK Mana Research Lab, still in its testing phase. In this case, some girls say that the man must be a great hunter, but he replies that he works in a skills management agency that helps them. Being directly affiliated with the director of the place, the girls realize that the boy is actually that person. Even though it's embarrassing, the man confirms that he is the son of the nation's best hunter, Hong Seokyang. The girls are impressed by this, but our protagonist states that Hong is just his adoptive father. It's said that he suffered an accident as a child, losing his parents. In view of this, the agency director saved and adopted him, having worked hard after that to repay this debt and now working for him. In such a case, the man laughs and asks the girls not to think of him as a playboy because he worked for this position. However, this was a lie, and while the girls say it's nice for his son to work with his father, the hero thinks he used his hunter's license to his advantage. Given this statement, the girls ask why the man came there. He then informs them that he is on vacation to celebrate his promotion and that at first he wasn't going to come but was expelled for never taking days off, which made them laugh. At this moment, the protagonist asks if he is bothering the girls, and they respond that he is not because he showed them something cool, asking to see it again. When asked about the name of this thing, our hero responds that it is a miniature multimodal hunter communication device called a mana watch. They ask how it differs from a conventional watch and how to use it, so he explains that it recognizes mana patterns so only the owner can use it. In an attempt to show how it works, the hero activates the watch, creating a hologram that shows various data about the hunters, making the girls understand. Among the dungeons on the watch, one was already known by one of the ladies, but suddenly the threat level of this dungeon starts to rise abruptly. An alarm is triggered, turning the hologram's color to a vivid red. Thus, the dungeon's destruction is announced, making everyone at the place desperate. Obviously, these were very bad news. In this case, our hero grabs his phone to take a call. Upon answering, he comments that he already knows about the confusion in Banjidong and states that despite the high concentration of people, it's just a D-ranked dungeon. However, he was informed by the other person on the line that it was no longer a D-ranked dungeon because half of the Sampa district was destroyed as soon as the mission began. This information leaves the boy in complete shock, and the person continues explaining that the agency director is on the way and will send a helicopter for the hero. Already in the aircraft, the protagonist thought it was ridiculous that half a district had been destroyed. However, he thought everything would be fine with the director's arrival. In such a case, our hero is disappointed that his vacation is going this way, but notices that his mana watch is suddenly failing. Then, in complete despair, the helicopter pilot informs him that there are things below them, being immense and terrible monsters spreading chaos through the city. On June 2, 2044, something never before thought happened. All the nation's dungeons suffered an unexpected break. Continuing with breaking news, the phenomenon of dungeon dismemberment is not only happening in South Korea, but also worldwide. And the status of the hunters who went on attacks with Hong Seokyang is still unconfirmed. While flying over the place in the helicopter, it's said that they cannot return to business anyway, as there were flying monsters all along the way. Making the report to the chief section, it said that they found survivors and will proceed to the skills management agency. On the road amidst the turmoil, some hunters still tried to resist, with one of them managing to subdue a huge canine monster. However, chaos was taking over everything, and our hero was just hoping his device could connect to the director's agency. Finally, it did, but Hong's vital signs could not be traced. In this case, the boy wondered if South Korea's strongest hunter was really dead. The future the hero wanted was simple: just offload all the irritating tasks to others and live a comfortable life. To achieve this, he fought hard and got close, but he needed someone to support him, which is why he had to find the survivors. Amid all that confusion, the protagonist heard a cough and quickly turned his face back. Unexpectedly, he realized it was his aunt, who told him not to call her that. However, the girl's condition was much more important than anything else. The boy asked if she knew what had happened, and she said that all she knew was that the centipede that came out of the Banjidong dungeon caused this. In response, our hero took a potion from his pocket and asked if it was centipede venom, stating that it wouldn't work. She recalled warning the boy that this dungeon needed to be cleared, so the protagonist countered by saying that Hunter's advice isn't always reliable. Anyway, you said she was already finished, asking the boy to leave, and in this case, she handed him a pendant. However, in the middle of explaining what this thing was, the girl decided to stop, stating that he couldn't understand it. In conclusion, she explained that she brought it just as a precaution and was happy about it. In this case, the hero didn't understand the reason for the happiness, and it was explained that he should have it. The pendant was something of Hong's, and the hero stated that he wasn't his real son. However, being the only one considered, the girl asked him to at least give him a funeral. Our protagonist understood what needed to be done, but explained that he wasn't giving you a funeral, asking her to stay alive. However, in her final moments, the girl said she couldn't control this kind of thing, already being lucky to endure for so long. As one of her last words, the girl called for Wu Huijie, our protagonist, asking if he remembered how he used to follow her, calling her older sister. The boy questioned why this was being brought up now. In conclusion, you explained that the boy used to be cute, but now that he had grown up a bit, he had become a brat. Finally, the girl asked her old friend to look the other way so she could go in peace, but Huijie refused, stating he had more healing potions. You informed him that her sword was in the corner, telling him to take it, but our hero remained in denial. The girl knew that Huijie was learning to use a spear due to the master's influence, but again asked the boy to accept her sword. Moreover, she ensured that, above all, he stayed alive. Finally, the hunter's last moment arrived amidst the flames and destruction in the city. At that moment, all the protagonist could do was close the girl's eyes while taking Yu's sword and wondering how he should survive in this ruined world. In the end, he just hated all of this, and at the skills management agency, The whole place was in ruins as expected. Even though hunters gave their bodies to achieve their goals, having so many hunters' bodies on the ground to defeat a single monster was unbelievable. The report is that the strongest hunter really died, leaving nothing but a dog tag. In view of this, Huiji wondered what he should do about it. He thought if he should continue looking for survivors, but even if he found one, he didn't know what he would do. Given such an apocalypse, it was unlikely that any D-rank hunter had survived, so our hero was filled with rage, imbued blue mana into his sword, and with a curse that released his pent-up feelings, he attacked the already lifeless centipede's body. However, after the attack, the unexpected happened. That immense corpse simply vanished suddenly, and with a golden light descending from the sky, an item appeared, calling to be picked up. Upon collecting the strange object, Huiji wondered if it came from the monster and stated that he had never heard of a monster dropping items before. Upon closer inspection, the object looked a lot like a watch, and suddenly it activated a verification procedure. The authorization implementation procedure was denied, so the emergency phase began. Not knowing if this was something with artificial intelligence, the object asked if the hero would like to set a date. In response, the protagonist asked what the device was mumbling, and it reiterated the question. Suddenly, the automatic sequence is activated, and the watch asks if the hero wants to execute. Our hero is intrigued that the thing was asking to set a time a few seconds ago, and now is asking to execute something. Already irritated, Huiji asks what the hell the device wants him to execute. From this, a warning is issued, making the protagonist wonder if what he's seeing is the centipede. However, a danger is detected and he understands that the previous one was not even half the size of this one. This is definitely the one that turns South Korea into this anarchy. As the monster approaches, the system warns that the survival probability is 10%. Our hero, in light of this, states that he doesn't care what it is and asks the device to execute whatever it is, thus having his identity confirmed. The emergency protocol is quickly initiated along with the verification protocol. After verification, a failure occurs to execute the savior, so the device tries again, but the user is deemed ineligible. At this moment, Huiji thinks about fleeing, and in this case, the device enters forced execution along with the final sequence, which is approved. The qualification also remains eligible, with the possibility of qualification now being verified. At this instant, the device warns that the world is bound for destruction, with Hu being the final survivor, and in light of this, he just tells the watch to shut up. With the survivor confirmed and all procedures accepted, the object begins to move the hero to a random moment in the timeline. Suddenly, the protagonist wakes up on the ground while being slapped in the face by someone desperately telling him to wake up. After Wu wakes up, the people apologize but inform him that no matter how many times they try, he wouldn't wake up, so they treated him and took drastic measures. In that strange environment, our hero is still confused, so the girl says she is calling him because things are really bad right now and he has a sword. With his life again in his eyes, Huiji didn't understand what was happening because as far as he knew, the world had been destroyed. Moreover, the people in front of him are wearing old hunter uniforms, and the girl, in turn, continues by asking if the man is okay and if he suffered a concussion. In this case, she explains that she won't be able to heal him with her powers, and the protagonist is intrigued by the old computers in that room. Amidst that agony, the protagonist realizes by looking at the schedule that he is in the year 2024. Interrupting his thoughts, a boy named Hyuk can no longer stand the hero's slowness, deciding to intervene. He states that the people in that building don't have time to wait until he feels completely well. With his arms crossed, he continues with his complaints, but at the same moment, Huiji disappears at speed, appearing at the building's window. Hyuk is confused, and the protagonist finally understands his situation. On April 5, 2024, in Myeongdong in the capital Seoul, a herd of black buffalo monsters invaded the area. After that, of the 46 people in the building, only 5 managed to escape alive. Facing his new reality, the protagonist wonders what is happening. The events before he lost consciousness and the corpses of monsters and people fill in the road, along with Hugh's death and the agency director's death. The suspicious item that appeared after the centipede died disappeared, and finally, the hero really went back to the past. He had published an article on dungeon breaks as an undergraduate student, so he knows well. Just before the creation of the magical measurement device, when dungeons were managed manually, as it was in the center of Seoul, it had been easy. Still, dungeons are unpredictable because one that seemed calm the previous day could explode the next. The Management Guild, which didn't want to lose an incredible S rank, ended up falsely reporting it with a B classification. Our hero, however, only received news of the break after the first round of casualties, already too late to take any action. The high school students who were training to become hunters tried to protect the civilians, but there was no way they, who had just awakened, could know how to handle it. The only survivors were 2 students and 3 civilians. This incident was a setback for the newly created Hunter School, contributing to the creation of numerous laws. Huiji thinks having Yu Juan's sword and is confident he can escape this situation alone. In light of this, he asks the others how long it has been since the dungeon broke, which confuses them. Asking if they are students from the Hunter School, the hero asks if they didn't learn anything about dungeon breaks, and one says they came to learn. In this case, Weiji tells him to start learning now, again asking about the break, and in view of this, a woman informs him that it was about 4 hours ago. However, exact numbers are necessary. In this case, the girl from before states it has been 3 hours and 40 minutes, and they haven't had communication with the outside for 2 hours. In his mind, the protagonist thinks that the agency director was in this team, and he blamed himself for only attacking the chief without realizing that his students were dying. However, this won't happen this time. Then, abruptly, Hewitt questions our hero's identity. In his head, it was a bad idea to trust someone they barely know, and in light of this, the boy asks for the man's hunter license if he has one. Blatantly, Widget claims to have lost the license, but he has it in his wallet, only unable to take it out because the issuance date is 2031. Now that the hero thinks about it, he has no form of work identification anymore, and even if he gets out of this situation, he won't be able to verify the dungeon. After the boy is disappointed with the information, our hero says he just needs to prove he is a hunter, and with his sword, he slashes the ground, releasing blue fire flames. Seeing such a demonstration of power, the students are convinced of the man's identity, not knowing if they will survive but believing they are safer with the hero. Suddenly, they spot the group's precious son, Dayan, among them, and in this case, it is likely that the support group will come to rescue him. With this matter being addressed, the protagonist remembers the younger son of Dayan, who is one of the world's largest conglomerates. They valued this boy so much that after his death, they helped maintain Hunter High School by establishing the Skills Management Agency. In this case, the doubt remains about what would happen if the boy came out alive. So even without an identity, Wonji understands that he could come out of this as a savior. When asked where they are going, the protagonist responds that they are going to the city hall because, although he wants to save them, he still wants to create a situation where he saves them from danger. With the news of the trip to City Hall spreading to everyone's ears, a man becomes desperate because it's a hard-to-reach place. In light of this, Weiji finds it incredible to experience something from the stories because, in the testimonies, this man's denial against the boy's ideas was noted. He remembers that on this day, the man's authority reigned over the students due to the age difference, so this time, Weiji decides to deal with the man through threats. Having managed to get rid of the first unforeseen event, the protagonist informs that even if saving them isn't easy, he can't leave the children behind. In this case, he asks if they want to leave alone, saying he won't stop them, and one of the girls in the group refuses, stating they can't leave anyone behind. Questioning if the old man is listening, the protagonist informs that it's because of people like them that he's saving someone like the old man. Changing the subject, he says he needs a map and asks if anyone knows the Myeongdong area well, receiving a volunteer. With a map in hand, he draws the place where they are and where the dungeon is, also informing that after the break started, the Minotaur must have already been taken. Upon hearing the monster's name, the students are frightened because it's an S-rank boss, and Huija informs them that the buffaloes likely follow the chief to Namsan. In this case, it is probable that only monsters separated from the herd are on the road, and circling Old Juro Station, the hero asks if the students know what it is. The girl from before raises her hand, saying it's the outer part of the blockade because it had been said that a line of defense would be set up to prevent the monsters from spreading. This statement was correct, and with the City Hall station along with the headquarters, they just needed to get closer to the place. Giving a viewpoint, a boy questions if it wouldn't be better to stay put because with the chief's defeat, the dungeon ends. In view of this, our hero informs them that the Minotaur is a dictator with everything it commands being obeyed, and in this case, with the leader's disappearance, remnants remain. These remnants are hungry monsters with a good sense of smell, but are just wandering for now. With the explanation finished, Widja asks if there are any more disagreements with the plan, and apparently, there are none. So the plans continue with the protagonist asking if the group contains mages who know how to draw runes. Later, the preparations begin, and our hero reprimands the mages for some mistakes made in the drawings. As a warning, he informs them that monsters are sensitive to mana, so the runes must be drawn as perfectly as possible. A girl, however, asks if these runes really hide the mana, saying she has never heard of such a thing before. Our protagonist thinks that compared to the runes of this period, it is indeed a reasonable reaction and explains to the girl that when it is on the ground, it hides the connected mana. However, it does not have the ability to hide cast magic. In this case, Wedja asks if everyone knows the procedure for activating the runes. First, you fill your hand with mana and touch the rune. In view of this, at the moment he leaves, they are ordered to activate them immediately, and Sunjin has a weaker seal. Upon leaving the place, the hero informs that he will release his mana and attract the monsters in a loop around the neighborhood, but when he passes again, the students will start running. With everyone understanding the plan, Huija jumps off the building with his sword to face numerous monsters alone. Like a true hero, he lands in the middle of the monsters, making them confused, and at that moment, the protagonist thought he should have a red cape. After leaving the building, the woman questions the identity of that man, and Hywook is indignant that at a moment like this, that's what the girl is worried about. The student with glasses comments that the hero already knew about the dungeon chief, questioning if he is not one of the hunters from the raid, with the girl responding that it's possible. The girl at Bang says that the boy might have fallen into a trap while going to the chief, so one of them says that if that really happened, the hero is weak. In the end, Hyuk says that the only thing they can do is trust the man because he managed to stir up all the monsters in front of the building. After the students' conversation, the old man calls everyone and Hyuk asks if the preparations are done. With a positive response, the old man warns that he will run with all his strength along with them, asking them to be careful. Finally, Hwije is seen by the students running towards them. In a cunning trick, the protagonist throws asphalt dust into the monster's eyes, temporarily blinding them. At that moment, the hero takes the opportunity to attack with his fire flames, thus taking down some of the monsters. Given this fact, along with the hero's confirmation, the students promptly gather to quickly get out of there. As ordered, the martial arts hunters take the lead, and mages cast a shield on both sides so that if there are any stragglers, the shields will block them. After that, the civilians will just run for their lives, and the healer, along with the swordsman, will stay at the rear. Suddenly, one of the herd monsters appears right next to Sungjin's face, leaving him speechless. However, quickly our hero comes to his rescue, landing a powerful kick on the bull's head, making it dizzy. Having seen his savior, Sungjin is worried, but Hwije, in a state of distress, just tells him to go away as fast as he can before it's too late. Releasing his power, blue flames take over the area and impregnate the monsters' bodies. Finally, Hwije reiterates his order, telling everyone to get out of there. From the top of a building, our protagonist can't understand where these bastards keep coming from. He thinks it was hard to get out of there and understands that he is responsible for attracting them, but still didn't expect such difficulty. In a brief summary of everything that happened, the hero leaks his mana on purpose to gather the monsters and erases a bit of the rune that hides mana so that Sungjin would be in danger. Just before being attacked by the monsters attracted by his mana, he made a sacrificial scene, and finally, a new hero was born. In the end, no one died and everything went perfectly well. In this case, everything is great. Then the protagonist wonders what he should do from now on. In case he really went back in time, it means that his old self, Hwije, is also somewhere. Fortunately, it won't be like in the movie where changing the past results in erasing oneself from history. Moreover, the suspicious item also said that this is a world guaranteed to be doomed, probably related to the Banji-dong dungeon. With some surprise, our hero, while thinking about the dungeon, receives a notification from his mana watch, realizing that it still works. In light of this, the hero starts looking for something in the device's data, coming across something that shocks him. He had to know the reason for appearing there that day, now understanding that there is a reason for all of this. In summary, the watch is telling the hero to change the world. Cutting his train of thought, the protagonist sees a group of hunters fleeing from one of the monsters in despair. Facing the monster, the hunters wonder if it wants to fight more, cursing it as damned and annoying. From the top of the building, the protagonist thinks these must be the Namsen hunters, with no need to interfere as the chief was defeated by this team. Additionally, among them was the agency director, who instructed everyone to concentrate their efforts on defeating the boss. As if he were in a privileged position, the hero was impressed to witness the legendary Korean hunters of history fighting. One of the group members said it was time to act, casting a magic of wood and leaves to trap the animal's feet. In light of this, the hero recognized the unique archmage Kim Charman's magic, something that was completely lost after her death, being an honor to witness with his own eyes. The cause of her death was a mystery. The threat level of Banji-dong had not changed for 20 years, but 2 S-rank hunters could not do much, considering that a monster was hiding in the area. That's why the future could change if he continued to save those originally destined to die, like the school students. First, it was necessary to close the dungeon and then find the lair where the person who ascended Seoul was hiding. Considering his plans, Hwije thought it wasn't bad at all, as by rescuing them, he could still create a debt with them, ensuring his retirement in the future. Continuing the battle, the guild leader landed a blow with his spear, cutting the animal's foot. Kim, in turn, with all her available power, activated her vine elimination magic. At this moment, the immense monster screamed in pain while being immobilized by the vines. Injured, the boss, in an act of fury, tried to defend itself as best as it could. It grabbed a piece of construction beside it and swung its immense axe, trying to eliminate all the hunters. At that moment, Hwije decided it was time to head to City Hall, leaving the fight against the boss to the members of the hunter group. During the fight, the group's mage told Mr. Hong to cut the monster's remaining leg, and he quickly understood the command. The girl added more magic to her spell, contributing to immobilizing the monster. The guild leader moved to the buffalo's back. He managed to pierce the animal's flesh while more and more vines were launched. This impressed our hero, but more important than the group's abilities was the fact that the monster started to fall on top of the building where Hwije was. The group leader, after wiping sweat from his face, unexpectedly spotted a person on top of the building. At this moment, the hunters became worried, but Hong said it was not a civilian because the person was wielding something. To defend against the fallen monster, Hwije made a vertical slash imbued with blue flames, completely finishing off the monster. The hunters were left speechless, unable to believe what they had just seen, and the buffalo was completely incinerated. Amidst the monster's body, our hero raised his hand showing he was alive and told the hunters not to worry about him and to get back to work. With the same expression as before, the hunters remained paralyzed, now wanting to know the protagonist's identity. Then, deciding to maintain his anonymity, Ouija humbly stated he was just a passerby. In an interrogation room, a guard asked Hong if he would like to continue alone because even though they had taken the man's weapon, it still wasn't safe. The guard informed him that this suspicious man had no social security number, no awakening number, and no fingerprint information. Hong understood but still had something to ask the boy. In this case, the guard only asked the hunter to be careful. With the two face-to-face, silence reigned while our hero was handcuffed for the interrogation. With a smile, Hong informed him that he had turned off the camera on the way there so they could talk in peace. Starting with names, the hunter introduced himself as Hong Seokyang, and the protagonist thought that seeing the young director confirmed his temporal regression even more. It was strange to think that this director would save little Ouija in a year and adopt him in 2. Finally, he introduced himself to the man. Handing a paper to the interrogated, the hunter asked if he knew what it was. In light of this, the protagonist understood that it was the drawing that covered the laboratory wall. Seeing the boy's intrigued expression, Hong already had his question answered, which left Ouija surprised for having let it slip. In this case, the hunter asked the boy not to be nervous because he was only there to talk. Moreover, Hong informed him that they were very worried about him, which confused Ouija because in his mind, no one there knew him. Hong explained that if everything had gone according to plan, he would have found something better, but still the boy managed to get out safely. Upon hearing this, the protagonist did not understand what the man was talking about, so he handed him a paper, informing him that he was the teacher Kim was looking for. The hunter mistook our hero for a Bangju whistleblower and explained that he had been worried since losing contact with them after what happened with Kim. In the protagonist's mind, he understood that in the past, a member the director was supposed to contact had died along with this man. Back to the subject, Hong says they agree to help with the escape and wants to catch these guys as much as the hero does, already alarmed and preparing his identity. They were too busy dealing with the Myeongdong incident to pay attention to a random hunter, so the hero's hunter name stayed as Wu. In light of this, Ouija thinks he is lucky because this will explain his trajectory, but he knows that even so, the agency director still won't trust him. In this case, the hunter asks if he can call the hero Ouija, and he says yes. After the formalities, Hong informs him that the hunter will be his employee for a while, and when asked if he will be under surveillance, the hunter replies yes. Anyway, while extending his hand to the protagonist, the man says he looks forward to working with the boy. In the end, even in another timeline, our hero ended up working with the agency director. However, at the moment, he was neither a director nor his father. In conclusion, with a handshake, the two seal the agreement, thus creating a new hunter in this timeline. A week after the previous events, Ouija is dressed in workout clothes and very irritated. Hong asks about his stay, wondering if he is okay, and the hero states that he cannot be when he has been stuck in a place like this for a week. Laughing, the hunter says he visits him every day, so Ouija gets angry, showing his ankle monitor and saying they are treating him like a prisoner. Telling him not to be so negative, the hunter asks him to see something good in it because the hero managed to escape and is now free. Besides, he had a lot to do. In this case, the protagonist states that the gentleman is the one with a lot to do, and the hunter only asks to be called uncle or something like that. Changing the subject, Hong asks if Ouija remembers the 5 children he saved in Myeongdong. Hong states that those are his students, and the hero believes the hunter didn't just find out about this now, thus considering the possibility of having passed the test. With a smile, Hong says he heard that the boy was the one who attracted the Minotaurs, and because of that, they managed to take care of the students. If the bait had been thrown, it was a fact that the damage would have been much worse. In this case, the protagonist starts to understand how this matter will be handled. Initially, the hunter wanted to know where all those buffaloes came from, but what matters in the end is that the results were good and the children are fine. In this case, he says he is thinking of something, but the hero knows that the results of this man's thoughts are never good. Knowing the skill level of his students, saving them would already be difficult, but the protagonist managed to save even the civilians. Many students were crying because Hong found the savior and feeling the need to repay the deed. After thinking a little, he takes something out of a folder. With a contract taken out of the folder, the hunter asks the hero to teach them. It is informed that the protagonist will be very suspicious if he follows him into the dungeons, but if he works as a teacher, he can mask his identity. Understanding the man's request, Ouija thinks about the matter a little before giving his answer. Just looking at the agency director, it was clear how deep the bond between disciple and master ran. At the agency, there are many people who consider the director their teacher. They would have done very well on their own but voluntarily joined the agency. If Wu creates a good connection with these guys, they should guarantee his future after saving the world, but it would be stupid of him to reveal his thoughts now. In response to the director, Ouija asks what he will teach the children when he can't even use mana, because if it's just how to fight, the uncle will be a better candidate. Hong in turn agrees it is easy to teach how to fight, but the problem is magical. Unexpectedly, the hunter heard about the runes that hide mana and used that to pressure the boy. In this case, the boy thought he should have kept quiet. Going straight to the point, Ouija asks if the hunter wants him to teach them about runes, and Hong says he wants more like these to be taught. In his thoughts, the boy believed he would teach how to invade dungeons, but he understood that it would be suspicious for an illegal awakened like him to know so many things. Excitedly at first, the hero states that runes are not magical, and that he is not suitable to teach, but Hong rebuts everything, stating that Wu is the perfect teacher. In this case, the protagonist wonders if he should just say he made them and patent them immorally. However, even if he didn't patent them, he would still be able to save many lives by spreading the knowledge about them because he wouldn't be able to save everyone personally. Laughing, Hong just hands him the pen, saying the boy knows he will do it anyway. Taking the pen to sign the contract, Wenju says he is doing this only for the children. Hong explains that he is already taking care of the certified copies in the bank account. Additionally, he informs that the school is his, so Wu will be listed as a guild member. Since the hero wasn't doing dungeon raids, there was no other incentive, so his monthly salary was based on minimum wage, which shocked Huijia. Furthermore, the protagonist will receive only 90% of this during the internship period, and as for vacations, he won't be able to give them since it is a business of only 5 people. However, it is said that they take days off on public holidays, and although the children call them even on those days, the choice to go will be up to him. In the end, only after signing the contract did Wu realize he was being tricked. 2 days after the conversation, the two are in a van heading to the school, and Hong comments that he likes Wu's sword. He also says that the sword recognizes its owner and has already sent many people to the hospital. When asked if it was the boy's, he replied that it belonged to someone he knew. Finally, the hunter asks if the sword was stolen, and the protagonist informs him that if he had stolen it, he would have been burned along with it. In this case, the hunter asks if the hero is angry because he won't return the sword to him. And Huijia says that even if the sword were returned, he wouldn't be able to use it because of the mana restriction device. However, Hong informs him that the school doesn't allow blades anyway, and that it's not like the classes will require weapons. In this case, the protagonist says the hunter can say he doesn't want a suspicious man with a weapon around his students, and although he evades the topic, he doesn't deny it. Suddenly, while looking at the road, something surprises Wu Huijia's eyes. Realizing they are going into a forest, he asks if they are on the right path, remembering that the area around the school was urban, not rural. With a smile, the hunter explains that this is due to the area being restricted from development because of the nearby dungeons, making it perfect for hunters. After a few more minutes of travel, they finally arrive at the location and park the car. Facing 3 buildings that look like containers, the protagonist asks if this is really a school, and Hong says he based it on a gloomy architecture. However, Huijia thinks there is nothing gloomy there and that actually there is just nothing, so the hunter explains that they will build buildings next year when they can. Hearing this, the boy asks if he will have to teach there until next year, and with a sparkle in his eyes, the hunter states that the path to the top has to start somewhere. In this case, without further ado, he is welcomed to the hunter graduation school. Calling everyone's attention, the guild leader introduces Mr. Wu, saying that he will be responsible for teaching about runes. Knowing that some of them had seen him before, he asks them not to be too hard on the new teacher. Raising his hand, one of the students asks if this gentleman didn't use a sword instead of magics, so Hong explains that it is not necessary to be a mage to use runes. Another asks if they will learn the mana-hiding rune or new ones, being answered by the hunter that Wu will teach new skills that can be very helpful. However, it is also asked if it was okay for Huijia to teach him about this, and the director explains that if he hadn't agreed, he wouldn't even be there. One of the girls also decides to ask a question, wondering if only mages will be able to participate in this lesson. The director explains that no, but the mages will be the only ones who can draw them. However, the school is flexible so that everyone can join if they want. With his hand raised, one of the students asks if the teacher wasn't injured in the incident. Therefore, everyone agrees that they were worried about him for leaving so suddenly. All the students were commenting among themselves that they thought the worst had happened, asking if the teacher was sure of his condition. Hearing this, the heart of our hero warms, understanding that these kids are kind and innocent, being different from the hunters 20 years later. If someone died, it was their fault, but if you survived, it was thanks to them. This was the attitude that the whole world had in the future. The protagonist thinks that the person who was stabbed in the back by a group member in the dungeon and ended up dying was one of these students. As he looks around the room, something catches the protagonist's attention. It's Park Seo-yin, who looks very different from the last time he saw her. In just 10 days since the incident, the girl has already become the witch he knows. On April 5, 2024, in the Myeongdong dungeon. Talking among themselves, one of the students asks Soo-yin to take a look at the rune he drew. Advising, the girl says she doesn't think the line should be so long, and the student with glasses realizes his mistake. He says it's very difficult, but the girl makes it look easy. In this case, she says her grandfather taught her when she was young. Back to work, the girl asks the boy to draw Hyunwook's rune because she will draw Sungyeon's. In this case, he asks if the student isn't tired. She, in turn, says not to worry because she has more experience as a mage than the boy, advising him to rest instead of her. Wanting to say something her grandfather always said, a voice comes into Park's head, saying that arrogance ruins everything. She imagines a scenario where Sungyeon's rune doesn't work and he cries. While Park thinks that everyone will be saved because of her, the voice returns to her head, reiterating for the girl to remember that inevitably, arrogance ruins everything. In 2044, at the Skills Management Agency, the witch waited patiently, consequently scaring those around her. This even made two men leave uncomfortably. With her colleague's arrival, he asks what the girl is doing. After welcoming Hyunwook, the boy continues asking if she is waiting for Mr. Hong. After denying the question, suddenly Hwiji appears, squeezing through and asking the hunter to get out of the way. Brushing the dirt off his shoulders, the protagonist states he didn't call the two there just to talk. So he introduces himself as Woo, an assistant of the dungeon raid. Questioning this dungeon raid thing, Hyunwook asks where the boy is from, and he explains his work supporting the director and evaluating dungeon safety. However, Hyunwook continues questioning what this guy is talking about. In this case, with a passive-aggressive expression, the hero states he works in the director's office. Back to the current timeline in his quarters, Hong asks Hwiji to stay at the inn for now, and the boy is happy not to have to live in a container. Taking the elevator to leave, the director wishes the new teacher a good night's sleep. Looking at his ankle monitor, the protagonist remembers that when he was young, he used to wonder why he had to learn these things. At this moment, he easily removes the protective seal from the device, saying that the director was right because, in this world, you need to know everything about technology. With his watch activated, Hwiji wonders what he should look at first, whether it's the history of the group that caught Hong or the records about Kim that might be there. Entering the Public Communication Information Disclosure section, the protagonist searches his pre-established topics, entering the subject of Seoyin. After reading various information, Hwiji says he already knows all these things, actually wanting to understand what changed her personality. With the information section open, a danger notification appears, warning anyone who reads the content. The first piece of information presented about the girl is that Park Seo-yeon hates compliments. In this case, Hwiji is confused because she smiled when he complimented her. The second piece of information is that if Park isn't smiling, the person is in danger and must call emergency services, but must never mention Myeongdong. In this case, apparently this incident changed her personality, which made sense since the protagonist knew that in Myeongdong there wasn't even an intact body. However, this time the hero saved everyone, making him wonder what the girl's problem is. In the end, the protagonist decides to leave this matter for later, thinking it's not relevant at the moment. Among many pieces of information, something written by Hong is read by Hwiji, an article from Kark's Research Center published on June 1, 2025. The next day, the protagonist goes to the rural area again in his workout clothes, questioning why he was dragged there so early. Suddenly, the first student appears, but Hwiji is lost in his thoughts of being in an empty place just like his future will be. He is indignant to realize that they will need to develop this place and build a new building, questioning if it should exist because in the 20 years remaining, he could live in luxury. However, at this moment, the voice of the girl who died in front of him telling him to stay alive returns to his head, bringing him back to sanity. After being ignored for a long time, the student finally snaps, shouting for his teacher and scaring him. Hwiji is completely disoriented and the student asks why the teacher is thinking so much. Upon taking a closer look at the child, the hero remembers that this is Lee Sung-yin, which makes him happy. Changing the subject, the student asks where Mr. Woo's sword is because his aunt was curious after hearing about it since she also uses a sword. The protagonist tries to understand better, and Lee, trying not to brag, explains that she is a famous hunter. Thinking about Sung-yin's aunt, the protagonist believes she must be the youngest daughter of the president of the Daein group and the Daejeon Guild master Lee Mijin. As she is a skilled hunter, and considering how much Lee admires her, his future may already be secured. At this moment, when our hero was about to have his perfect chance, Hong interrupts the conversation, calling him and telling him to come over. Upon arriving at a warehouse, Hwiji asks the reason for his summoning, so the director explains that he is preparing a class for him. When asked if the class will be in this room, the hunter explains that they were using the room as a storage space and that he will clean it later. In the protagonist's mind, this means they will never clean it, but he decides to forget about it and address another issue. Hwiji asks for something to be done about the student Park Seo-yeon, which initially leaves the director confused about what to do. The hero explains that she is very different from when he saw her in Myeongdong, and Hong agrees, commenting that the girl's style has really changed. This disappoints Hwiji because the director believes it is just a style issue, and he explains that every hunter faces a wall at some point. As the student has been awakened for a long time, this ended up being the time. In this case, Hong asks if the boy is worried about his students, making him feel shy. In his mind, Hwiji thinks the director is a hopeless person because he is too confident, both physically and mentally. Both the concerns of normal people and the fact that someone can't get up after being knocked down are incomprehensible to him. The modern dungeon strategy is divided into before and after the evolution of the runes, which were long neglected due to several fatal flaws. But after an archmage in France revealed the mana rune's hiding place, everything changed, and despite the flaws, all mages learned the runes. By 2040, it was already a time when everyone drew them, even with mana pens being made, but at this moment, these remain exclusive to mages. With a smile, Hwiji begins his explanation but stops in the middle. In this case, several students along with the director question why the teacher stopped explaining. The protagonist is confused as to why hunters who can't use magic are attending his class, but he decides to continue normally. Continuing with the class, the hero asks if they are practicing a lot because that day there will be a level evaluation. After identifying a mistake in the drawing, the teacher calls out the student with glasses, Choi Jinwoo, who anxiously asks if the runes aren't activated by their margin of error. Looking at the final result of Choi's work, the protagonist asks if the student knows why runes weren't used in the past, then addresses the issue of convenience. When asked why it wasn't convenient, the student doesn't know how to answer, but Huiji understands it's a difficult question for a newly awakened person. While the dialogue between the two takes place, Park bites her pencil in fury, breaking it in half. Looking somewhat uncomfortable, the protagonist can't understand how only he finds this strange and asks if the girl knows the answer about the runes. With a sinister aura, the girl continues to break her pencil, leaving the teacher scared, not understanding how these behaviors are just about style. Finally, she suggests that it's due to the ease of erasing them, which is correct as in dungeons where the mana in the air is distorted. In this case, he asks how this can be compensated for, and Huiji, not being a mage capable of explaining the principles, simply asks the students to memorize everything. He cites durability and correction along with water resistance, amplification, and resonance. In light of this, the students are shocked at having to memorize so many things. The teacher explains that it's a combination that prevents runes from being easily erased, and that if the first one drawn is wrong, it won't be activated. Raising her hand, Park asks why the teacher didn't teach this before, and Huiji starts paying attention to the girl when she mentions Myeongdong. However, she asks to let it go because she drew the runes wrong in the first place, so they weren't activated. Given this reaction, the hero understands that Park Seo-hyun is in this state because he weakened Lee Sum-yin's runes. Being a hunter is a battle with oneself. Whether you win or lose that battle is your own problem. Besides, even after the incident, Park still became an archmage. So technically, her behavior isn't Huiji's fault and he could simply ignore it. With a desperate look, the girl thinks she drew it again and tries to hand the paper to the teacher, asking if it's correct this time. However, she's indecisive about her work and doesn't speak up. In her mind, she thinks she can't mess up again and starts judging herself in an endless cycle. In light of this, Huiji knows that even though it's not his fault as an adult and teacher, he has a duty to resolve the situation. While eating a bowl of rice with vegetables, the protagonist thinks he shouldn't have followed this old man. Just thinking about eating lunch in a convenience store in a container building was already bad. Breaking the ice, Hong comments about the runes. In response, the hero questions if they really have to talk about their knowledge while eating. However, he explains that someone he knows taught him what is correct because he had already said he wasn't a mage but knows a lot about runes. In his thoughts, the protagonist knows that suspicions have decreased, but the questioning remains. It seems that Hong doesn't know about the Art Research Center's operations. In an attempt to add context, the hero asks if it isn't a waste to let this knowledge disappear, stating he learned it to use in cases like this. In light of this, the hunter understands he brought something useless to the conversation and asks the teacher to forget what he said. Changing the subject, the hero asks about the two magic students and how the director is teaching them. Hong explains he is giving them all the magic books he found. Seo-hyun learned magic from her grandfather, but Jinwoo appears to be the real problem because he has talent but still finds it hard to find a master. In this case, with an animated expression, the hunter asks if the teacher knows anyone, to which he responds that he already said he isn't a mage. In light of this, the hunter only states he asked to be sure and Huiji, for his part, really doesn't know anything about magic. However, he will make sure to teach all the runes he knows, which leaves the agency director astonished to the point of nearly spitting out his food. In response, the protagonist questions if it's something to be surprised about and states as a condition that the director will have to disclose all the runes when the time is right. However, the director was still in shock, asking again if the teacher is serious. Then the hero replies yes and asks for his name to be the editor. Hong still questions the conditions but scoffs, asking if the director thought he would ask for gold, even though he is already their teacher. Responding to the query, Hong denies it but says he expected at most 1 or 2 runes to be taught, occasionally questioning the value of the mana-hiding rune. Huiji explains that he indeed planned to teach only a few things at first, but seeing the state of those children, it became obvious that they would die sooner or later. In this case, the hunter asks if the mage who created the runes gave permission to teach others, and the hero explains that this person would be happy to be saving lives. It is said that a French mage created the mana-hiding rune and its uses, and even with people making large amounts of money, he only wanted everyone to use them. In this case, at the very least, he wouldn't complain about him taking credit in his place. And at this moment, the protagonist states he has one condition. Saying he knows of a place called Arcades where many children are, the hero states he needs the hunter's presence there. Because of this, young Wu Huiji will be saved a year earlier due to his older version from the timeline. The next day, the sun shines on the horizon in the rural area. Smiling, the director says the attack now was good, but the student lost balance at the end and needs to make sure to keep it until the end. With a powerful attack from his spear that sends the student flying, Hong calls for the next in line. Hyuk is irritated and disappointed but can't do anything with his current level. At this moment, another student attacks the director from behind while Hyuk prepares to help by attacking from the front. However, the veteran hunter easily fends off the two, humiliating them. After defeating his students, the hunter laughs and asks the cute kids to come at him again, which makes our hero disgusted by their lack of elegance. Then the protagonist redirects his attention to his students, who despite having an outdoor class, remain elegant except for Jin's outburst. In this case, he understands that the students are at the age to do this kind of thing. Hwaejia asks Park if she is drawing what he instructed and asks to see if she is doing it correctly, but the girl firmly refuses. She explains that she will show it later once she can draw better, and the teacher is confused because his intention was to praise her to boost her confidence. So he explains that his role there is to help the students improve, but the girl again refuses, saying she will hand it in later. A bit anxious, the teacher tries to explain that he needs to see if she is cultivating a bad habit so he can correct it. Deep down, our hero knows he needs to encourage them in any way he can, but he doesn't understand how to motivate them. Reflecting on his past, the protagonist can only remember the mockery he made of the hunters, realizing that this is not encouraging. In contrast to the director's class, Hwaejia begins to remember his past when his adoptive father received a paper informing him that his son was second in school. With the paper in hand, Hong shouted with joy, proud that he didn't have to send him to a public school. However, something was not right in his son's expression. In this case, the hunter asked if the boy wanted to be first and informed him with a smile that he wouldn't mind negatively, even if he had come in last place. That day, Hwaejia replied that his score mattered a lot, making his father remember that the boy intended to go to college. Finally, the hunter replied that everything would be okay, telling the boy he could do whatever he wanted, no matter what it was. After recalling everything, the teacher informed the girl he understood her case, telling her to do as she wished and that she could show him when she was ready. With a friendly aura, Hwaejia says that from his perspective, the girl has the talent to become an archmage and much more because most are usually stubborn like her. However, this entire speech ended up causing the opposite reaction, generating an eerie silence. Hwaejia begins to sweat cold, not understanding what is wrong with the atmosphere. With some tears, the girl decides to apologize to her teacher. She hands him her work paper, saying she will let him check it. The teacher reiterates that the student can do as she wishes. Park continues holding the paper, and Hwaejia tries to comfort her, saying she can take as long as she needs. But the girl insists that she was wrong while tears fall from her eyes. Faced with this reaction, the teacher is frightened, unsure if he said something wrong and thinks they should stop here. In this case, the protagonist tells the students to clean everything up and go home, and Jin thanks him for the lesson while Park nods. As the girl leaves, our hero thinks she didn't cry just because she was touched and simply can't understand where he went wrong. A security guard opens the door for the young master to get into the car while some of the students are around. As they leave, they say goodbye to the teacher, who wishes them a safe trip. Hwaejia asks if the students' homes are nearby and Hong denies, informing him that they have a place nearby that they can use as a dormitory. This shocks our hero, but he changes the subject to the sad cases of child abductions that are on the rise recently. It is said that the targets are usually awakened children, and the kidnappers do not ask for ransom. Moreover, witnesses do not care, and the kidnappings can occur in broad daylight. With a serious look, Hong comments if the place the protagonist mentioned is the ARC Research Center. In this case, Hwaejia asks if the hunter thinks all the children at ARC are kidnapped, which confuses the hunter. There are orphanages among the places managed by the agency, including the Sai he knows. In this case, it is certain that many are being exploited in secret. So Woo Hwaejia's condition is that the hunter saves all the children but also lets him participate in the operation. In this case, Hong asks if the boy realizes that he has made many confessions to him. The protagonist, in turn, asks the director to calm down, questioning if he would just take the children and end it without even looking around the research center. However, Hong states that the current teams already have enough members, but he is sure that the boy is hiding people who can breach ARC's security. To try to explain his reasons, Hwaejia says that there is a person he needs to find among the kidnapped children. Hong observes the hero's expression with some suspicion, but ultimately realizes that the hero is not lying. Finally, the agency director accepts the terms, informing him that it will be important for them to have a guide. However, he warns that it will take some time since they need to gather useful people, and when asked if they will be trustworthy, Hong confirms they will be. After all, the hunter was the type of person who didn't mess around when it came to children. The next day, the sky was clear and bright, with birds flying in harmony. Upon conducting a deeper analysis of his students, the teacher understands that Park is as gloomy as ever, while Jinwoo is measuring the room. Suddenly, some students appear for a visit, and apparently, our hero doesn't like his suck-up student. The girl accompanying Sungyeon is introduced as Soonjin, and the teacher asks if they aren't supposed to be in class now. The boy just ignores it, stating that the magic students are strange because they don't even take a lunch break. Then Hwaejia explains that they are reducing it on their own. In the end, the student understands that it's due to their class, but he says he can't sit in the same place for too long, and the hero asks if the boy is a swordsman. Sungyeon confirms he is and asks where his teacher's sword is, to which he replies that the director instructed him not to carry it around the school. Disappointed, the student says he wants to see it up close. And now that the hero thinks better, since there are two Ouijas in this place, it means there are two Yujuan swords. In this case, if there are two swords with this performance, even if it's not his main weapon, it's still quite tempting. After a luxurious car parks at the location, the girl gets out, and Hong greets her happily while she complains about the ruined roads. Unexpectedly, Archmage Kim Chiman appears right in front of everyone, and in Huiji's mind, he knows this didn't happen in the past and shouldn't be happening now. On his magical device, information about the girl is displayed, such as her position, unique magic, and teacher. With a sweet expression, the girl thanks for the offer but believes the only thing she can teach is the basic use of mana. Her magic requires high compatibility, and she believes none of the students have the aptitude for it. However, observing the girl who is Park Myeon's granddaughter, the mage comments that she probably already knows the basics, but Hong says she doesn't. Kim then asks why the director called her, saying she initially thought it was related to Arc. Hong then denies this, pointing to our protagonist. Seeing him, the girl is surprised to see the person on the roof on the day of the incident. Surprised, the girl asks if the boy is a mage because she saw him holding a sword in Myeongdong. Intervening, Hong explains that the boy is not a mage but knows something even better, and when asked if it is related to unique magic, a hypothesis is denied. Introducing himself to Kim, the teacher says he is teaching runes to the students while thinking he is grateful for the opportunity to meet an archmage like her. In light of this, Kim feels somewhat uncomfortable and comments that he is apparently not a friend of Hong. In this case, Ouija understands that in the girl's view, runes are worthless, and she tries to explain herself, but the protagonist decides to first demonstrate his knowledge. In an open area, the teacher instructs the children to bring the runes they have drawn outside. Koi needs to make a part of the drawing longer, ensuring it doesn't become a habit, and he accepts the advice. Park Seo-hyun is doing a good job but needs to stay confident in her statements. With the sample in hand, Kim is indignant with the complexity of the runes, and after the final versions pass the test, it's finally time to put them to the test. Activating one of the runes, a huge flame bursts out of the paper, leaving the girl very impressed. With the second activation, a brief rain starts, extinguishing the generated fire and turning it into smoke. Seeing this presentation before her eyes, Kim finds it all magical. However, she is irritated for not feeling any mana, questioning how the boys did it. With this, the teacher praises his students with a smile because even an archmage couldn't detect mana in their work. In this case, the real power of the mana-hiding rune is finally demonstrated to everyone. As it is the first time the girl sees something like this, she understands that the overlapping lines provide a different function, working better than if they were destroyed. Han explains that Ouija learned them from a mage. In this case, Kim begins to exude a sinister aura while asking the director to accept her as a student. Grabbing the hunter by the collar, the girl asks if she can also learn the runes. She states that she doesn't need a salary or anything, just needs to be allowed to take the class. In light of this, Han's expression starts to become more favorable. In this case, Kim gets the director's approval, leaving all the responsibility to our protagonist. Thus, the girl ends up under the care of our hero, who doesn't want to accept but clearly has no choice. A few days later, on May 15, 2024, everyone is already positioned in front of the research center. When asked who these people are, the director states that it's a team from someone trustworthy, but the protagonist comments that they don't look trustworthy, and Hong asks him not to worry. The goal is to confirm the children and block the escape route. If they can obtain some information and catch someone high-ranking, it will also be good. After everything is done, a signal will be given to cause some chaos. In this case, Ouija asks if they really have to do this, and the director says it is an improvisation. Excusing himself to the hunter, one of the men informs that his ability detected nothing, no life forms other than insects, and no security cameras. When asked if the basement is also empty, it is confirmed that it is, in which case, this isn't impossible. In light of this, Ouija tells everyone to go in, which confuses Hong. However, the protagonist is firm in his words, breaking the sealing chain of the place with his sword. The leader of the hunters panics at the use of mana control, asking what the boy is doing. It is said that something is off because they shouldn't be able to move easily due to the children being experiments that require a specific and sterile environment. Entering further into the place, our hero starts typing a password into one of the research center's doors. Upon completion, authorization is granted, and Hong comments that it would have been good if the hero had told him the code beforehand, but Ouija liked having tricks up his sleeve. After entering the elevator, the protagonist presses the 5th floor, which intrigues the director because it seemed like a high place. However, he is informed that it is the complete opposite. They are going to the lowest floor, the 5th basement level. Arriving at the 5th floor, one of the heroes comments that there is nothing there either, but it's not as if they knew they would be there. In this case, Ouija asks the hunters not to use any magic because the men initiated their emergency invasion protocol known as Pompeii. The men drew runes in hidden places that respond to the activation of magic, tuning so that if detected, the place will explode, which excites Kim. As they walk through the place, the protagonist thinks that seeing no dust around means they left recently and intended to return. In the past, this place definitely operated for 2 years before Hong's attack, raising the question of what changed for Ark to suddenly flee in the middle of the night. The protagonist is then surprised, because the door was locked, claiming that it was the main research lab, so the most important materials should be there. However, he didn't expect they would really make such a big sweep of that house. Looking around, he notices there were several toys. Hong, on the other hand, wonders if there were runes that activated by destroying the facility, and the boy replies that there shouldn't be. At the same moment, Hong ends up punching the glass, and the protagonist thinks that whether from the inside or outside, that place remained as incredible as always. Thus, a flashback of Jay appears, asking a girl what she was writing. She then replies that it was a logbook, because her father was a lawyer and said that evidence was important for matters like these. The little boy says to write that the lab chief hit the children. However, the girl says he didn't do that. Lee then takes the paper and says to write it that way, because that way it wouldn't be a lie. Thus, she could end up being a witness. Right after, the scene cuts again to another place, and an irritated girl wonders if that had been just a waste of time. Hong replies that it had not been a waste of time, because that was the Ark Research Center. The girl says she wouldn't have said that if she had some information about the research. However, that was not what he had promised. Next, another man shows up saying that he had removed all the explosives. Mission says that he was talking to her indirectly, mentioning that he could be hiding something from her, asking what it could possibly be. Right after, Hong starts looking at the protagonist. Mission says they needed some time to talk, and that's why they should leave already. Hong then asks if the girl had finished organizing, and she replies that she had. Mission says that the man had said there was nothing left, and the guy replies that it wasn't anything from the lab researchers, and had been left behind because a child was kidnapped. And actually, to be more precise, it was the protagonist's younger brother. The girl then starts analyzing that information, wondering what it was, because that dungeon had been a failure, supposing that someone might have escaped. Thus, 2 gates pass by, and the scene cuts to a seemingly sad girl. Then Jay shows up, asking if she was watching the ants, and the girl replies that she wasn't. Jay, on the other hand, asks what the girl was doing, to which she replies that it was nothing much. Observing the girl, Jay thinks that, since he didn't remember her, she was probably already dead for some time, asking what she was doing alone in that place, and if, by any chance, she was making her friend fight alone. And the girl replies that yes, because they couldn't beat the other person even with the 2 of them together against him. Jay thinks she was right, because that boy showed quite a bit of potential, even when compared to Park, and the rest wasn't that bad either. The girl, in turn, asks him to stop looking at the 2. Lee asks him about the idea for that battle, and the girl replies that it was the other man. Meanwhile, that fight was still going on, and the other boy seemed to be a bit irritated about something, saying that it was cheating. But the other boy asks if he didn't remember what the teacher had said, because you never know what might happen in a dungeon. For that reason, you should pair up with someone else, in case he got angry. Next, a car shows up at the place, where an unknown person appears, and then Lee shows up, calling that woman aunt. Mission, in turn, shows up, asking how the young man was. Lee replies that he had already told her not to call him that in public, and Mission, looking at the other boy, mentions that he had improved a lot. Surprised, he asks if that was true, because he had practiced his swordsmanship a lot. Mission says it was very good to have left him with Hunter Hong, so she wished the other younger ones had taken after him. Looking at the other boy, she mentions that he had grown a lot since the last time she saw him, asking if by any chance he wanted to join her guild, so she would treat him well like a sister. However, Lee then appears, saying that she was actually very old. Replying back, Mission says that he still didn't have a girlfriend. Then an argument between the 2 happens. The protagonist, watching that situation, thinks he had heard before that Mission adored her nephew. That's why he thought they would be more affectionate. However, that was quite normal. Then Hong ended up appearing at the place, saying he had brought food. He called the protagonist along with Kim to go eat. A while later, they were already eating, and Misan mentioned that she had bought a dungeon. However, she believed the government would take care of its management, because of the incident with the other dungeon that had happened. Thanks to that, other guilds were hesitant to make an offer, so he didn't have to pay much for it. Hong questioned if there had been an official evaluation. The girl responded that because of the previous invasion of the dungeon, Hong's evaluation had been postponed. Hong commented that this was why they needed to try the Bangji dungeon as soon as possible. However, there was a problem. There was still another dungeon belonging to Mizan. Hong asked if the protagonist had any idea what his brother meant by the diary. The protagonist responded that he didn't. He thought he really didn't know about that, because he had never written it in the past. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the protagonist giving his class. He said that, as they were already used to cover and support runes, he would teach them a new rune. At that moment, Kim received a message from his mother. The boy asked what she wanted. Meanwhile, Mizan was watching everything. She thought the protagonist was very handsome, but she still couldn't trust him. Kim then asked how many runes the protagonist knew in total. The boy questioned why she was so curious about it. She replied that it was nothing. She just thought it was natural for students to be curious about their master's skills. Jay then asked her not to say something so scary. He wasn't a mage, nor had he signed a contract, so she shouldn't call him master. Mijin, observing the situation, thought the protagonist was indeed very suspicious. Then, everyone around noticed the girl's irritation. Kim apologized. He said it was a habit and that he didn't mean to interrupt anything. Jae then resumed the lesson. He said he would teach them shadow runes, or at least that's what he called them. After finishing writing on the board, he asked if it wasn't really easy. Kim asked what the effect of that rune was. The boy responded that she should try drawing it. Sometime later, all the students were drawing the runes. Jae observed the drawings and said that this was much easier than the rune that concealed mana. This was a simple rune, so they should all learn to draw it right away. There were several runes to learn, and he asked if they could possibly spend days practicing all of them. The scene then cuts to the protagonist watching another girl. She asked to activate her rune. Mizan was surprised. Her vision was gradually becoming strange. Jeb explained that the runes synchronized the user with the shadows. That's why it seemed ineffective while it was bright. But once it got darker, the effect could be much more dramatic. Jae then asked how she thought she could use that rune. The girl responded that she didn't know. Jae said it was okay not to know. He didn't want to press with a question. They could learn slowly. Mizan then said she had a question. She asked him to explain what the rune that concealed mana was. Jae replied that it was exactly what she thought. He asked if she hadn't learned it from the other man, because he had used that rune to save the plans that time. Mizan responded that she hadn't heard anything about it. Hong had changed the subject and she didn't ask again what had happened. She was worried about other things at that moment. The scene then cuts to Hong talking about Kim's family. He explained that the family had an archmage with the same attribute for 3 generations. This was extremely rare even internationally. Even without experience with archmages, the family's reputation was enough. Hong asked if the boy knew what that meant. The boy responded that he didn't. Hong explained that Kim's rune had been proven by a prestigious archmage in the family. This meant that the pursuit by the arc and attacks from mages would target him. The protagonist asked them to announce in Kim's name that he would put an end to it all. Hong responded that he shouldn't live that way. He wondered what the boy was talking about, because that was an achievement alongside a mage. Hong asked if the protagonist thought he had silenced the plans. The protagonist, confused, asked if it wasn't him who did that. Hong asked why he thought they had never mentioned anything to the families, because no one knew that his rune would be remembered forever in history. He said the protagonist didn't need to worry about anything. He would make sure his name would be in the history books. Jae, on the other hand, wondered how many achievements he would accumulate at that moment. Moreover, he was thinking about the astronomical amount of royalties the thieves had taken. He thought that the French archmage didn't have to pay royalties. His desires were to save as many people as possible. With that money, he could acquire new equipment for the hunters in the agency, and still build a new building for the Hunter Academy. Meanwhile, Hong was watching Ja. The boy comments that he understood. Hong replies that he wasn't sure, but it seemed like everything was fine. For that reason, they should take a break and go out to eat something. Right after, the scene cuts to another location. Hong seems surprised as he asks what that was. Soon after, Misin appears, asking if they had already finished their meals. Hong, irritated, replies that this was the sacred territory of the school. He mentions that he could be reported if he called the place a school that day. He also says that staying there would be bad for the skin. Soon after, the scene cuts to a man taking a box out of the car. Mission asks if that was the last one, and the man confirms. The protagonist, watching the scene, wonders where that woman got all that stuff from. Mission replies that she had installed the subspace. It wasn't fully commercialized yet, but since her company had developed it, she was already using the first one. For that reason, he should contact her if he needed anything. Observing all this, the protagonist wonders if that was a future development of Daejin. Extending her hand to the protagonist, the girl says that she hadn't properly introduced herself before. She mentions that her name was Mission, and that the master of the guild called Daejin was helping Hunter Hong. From that moment on, she also intended to help the protagonist. Hearing this, Jae seemed pleased. He thought that finally the guild magnate had spoken to him. Right after, the scene cuts to All's room. Someone seems to have called the protagonist, asking if his main weapon was a sword. Jae, in turn, asks why he wanted to know that. Lee asks if they could be taught. Jae replies that they had the best hunters in South Korea at their disposal. Even so, they wanted him to teach them. The boy comments that the director used a spear. He had told the protagonist to teach them since he was occasionally absent from school. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Hong saying he should have been informed earlier. But since there were more teachers, he didn't need to be at school all the time. Moreover, they couldn't bring anyone else before officially revealing the runes to the public. Jae asks if the hunters from Daejin were reliable. Hong replies that she wouldn't lend her hunters. Besides, her people were outsiders. For that reason, it would be better for him to take care of things. Jae asks what made Hong think he was qualified. Hong replies that he could see it with his own eyes, because the eyes are the window to the soul. For that reason, he trusted Jae a lot. But in any case, he wouldn't let them use mana. They should just adjust their posture and other things, or they could fight training that way. He was sure they would learn something if they took a beating. Hong mentions that he had already warned them, because they would soon try to catch him off guard, and he had promised a reward if they managed to hit him. The protagonist asks what happened to Hyun. Hong replies that he left her with Kim, since she said she would try as healers and mages are similar. Then Hong says that he was bleeding. The protagonist asks where he was going. Hong replies that he was heading to the Rio District dungeon. Jae asks to go with him. Hong replies that he didn't know what Art could have done. For that reason, it was more dangerous. He should be the first to enter and check if there was anything suspicious. Even so, he would return soon. For that reason, Jae should take care of the kids for him. Right after, the scene cuts to the next day. Looking around, the protagonist wonders when people had brought a coffee truck. He asks everyone to remember just one thing, because the one who survives will be the strongest. Another boy comments that he didn't seem so impressive saying that. Jae, in turn, asks if anyone had ever been near a dungeon. Everyone remains silent. However, one person raises their hand. Jae asks how it was. The boy replies that it was very different, because there were theories that it was a completely different dimension from theirs. Moreover, there were no humans in the dungeons. To survive, one had to give up their humanity. Therefore, they shouldn't value being human. They should only follow their instincts in the dungeons. Asking if the director had given them a break from real fights, the students confirm that he had. Jae said he would teach them, but he wasn't as gentle as Hong, so he would destroy all of their instincts, and he wouldn't kill them, so they should give it their best. Then the scene cuts to Hong's group. They comment that it really was a rank D dungeon, because they had said that all dungeons would be re-evaluated soon. Sometime later, the group arrives at the dungeon. They were a group of 5 people. Upon entering, they seemed surprised. Maise asks if Hong could say something. Hong responds that he was embarrassed at that moment. He assumes it really was a rank D dungeon. Hong asks the other guy if there was any information about the monsters. The guy responds yes. He mentions that there were types of insects living in the area, but there weren't many. Besides, they seemed to be herbivores, because they had seen them eating leaves. They didn't show any interest in the meat and blood they had brought. Their body fluids were harmless, and they weren't acidic. So the core was in the middle of the forest. There were no monsters guarding it. Observing the surroundings, Hong seemed thoughtful, because a rank D dungeon was very peaceful. He wonders why Arky paid attention to that dungeon. Noticing the irritated girl, Hong asks if she didn't like insects. She replies that she hated all things with more legs than her. Hong then ends up showing one of the insects he had killed earlier. This makes the girl completely nervous about what she had seen. At the same moment, Hong asks everyone to wait. He starts analyzing the area. He says that there was something near them. Mission, observing this, seemed very surprised. She responds that there was a reason they hadn't reacted to the meat, because those creatures actually preferred rotten meat. Right after, the scene cuts to the protagonist. He asks how many times he'll have to tell her to write a report first. The girl responds that Jae had been in that place once again, and he wasn't joking. For that reason, she needed to clean herself up. Telling the girl to leave, Jae says that he needed to work. At the same moment, the boy wakes up, realizing that all of that had actually just been a dream. He wonders why she hadn't done that secretly on her own, and wanted to know why someone who never listened to him had asked for permission. But even so, he should forget all that and get back to work at once. Then the scene cuts to that place from before. The boy asks if the protagonist could tell the director to hurry up. Jae says he didn't have his number. For that reason, he wasn't sure what the guy had been doing for the last 4 days. However, if he had the energy to talk, then he should have rested properly. He asks if, by any chance, they wanted to start again. Shaken, the guy then apologizes. He says he wasn't sure what they had done. Observing the students, the protagonist says they already seemed very exhausted. For that reason, they doubted they were acting the same way with the director. However, the other girl responds that the director hadn't pressured them so hard. At the same moment, someone else appears asking if, by any chance, they wanted some water. So all the students seem more relieved. The other girl, Happy, says that he really was the healer, because they had really saved them. Shortly after, a car appears at the place. From it, an unknown girl starts to step out. The other girl, on the other hand, seems surprised by something. She asks why her sister was at that place. Kim then responds that she wanted to see her. Noticing the protagonist watching, the girl apologizes. She mentions that that was her younger sister. She asks the girl to greet him properly, because that was the new teacher she had been talking about before. The little girl, introducing herself, says that she had heard he had saved her sister's life. For that reason, she was very thankful. Observing the situation, Jae thinks he had a bad feeling about that, because that girl was being very respectful towards him. Also, he didn't even know that girl had a sister. He asked if by any chance she had gone to see her. Then the girl says they had said they needed a rank C hunter or higher, stating that she had really awakened before. Surprised, her sister asks when that had happened. The girl responds that it was during her class. Her sister asks if that's why the teachers let her leave. The girl replies that's it. She asks them what it felt like to awaken. However, the other guy responds that it wasn't anything special. Shortly after, her sister tells her to register as a teacher, because she'll be fine if she doesn't do that within a week. The girl responds that she had registered long after her awakening, but even so, she had never heard of that. The other girl replies that the director had taken care of that for her. That's why he had also received help. Right after, the protagonist asks Kim and Lars to register with them. The girl replies that she was rank S. The protagonist asks if Lars was bragging. Kim responds that things could get problematic if his name was listed there as a hunter, because the press loved to uncover things like that. He asks if the boy wasn't going. Kim then replies no, because he didn't have a phone. However, Kim says that girl had chosen Jae to go with her. Approaching the protagonist, the girl asks if she could be his disciple. However, Jae seemed a bit confused by that. The girl with sparkling eyes was still waiting for his response. Jae thinks that girl was a guaranteed genius because she was loyal, so he had various ways to use her if she stayed under his command. Even so, he couldn't do that. Thus, he ends up refusing her offer, saying that he wasn't a mage or anything like that, asking why he would have to take on some disciples. Jae says he read online that the golden period occurs 1 month after awakening. Therefore, he needed to remove impurities from the body using magic within the first 3 days. However, the protagonist says that people didn't believe that. The other girl states that she had heard of something similar before. She had received information that morning while waiting for the protagonist. She had just kept the information because she didn't have a trash can. Therefore, she shouldn't be misunderstood. Then Jae calls the girl, saying that it was completely false. For that reason, she shouldn't worry and should wait for the director. He asks if she had rested because now she should watch near her sister. Lee says she wouldn't want to go to that place after seeing how the classes were. The protagonist asks why she thinks that. He believes she might be interested. Personally, he found Lee very fun. Lee replies that of course he finds it fun because he's the one giving the classes. Ja counters, saying that's only because they're still weak. The scene cuts to the night. Kim asks if the awakening happened that morning. She asks how Hong knew that girl. Kim replies that he was helping the girls because he felt bad for 2 children living alone. The girl says she was very brave as she immediately asked Woo to accept her as his disciple. Moreover, she didn't give up after seeing the protagonist training the children. She had never seen him so troubled. Jae asked them to stop teasing him and to take a look at that right away. He says that was a body they had found in the Sompa district dungeon. Hong asks if he knew that person. The protagonist says he couldn't say that he did. Hong says that was the man who sacrificed his life so the protagonist could escape from Eric. He asks if the protagonist really didn't know him. He questions who the protagonist's true identity was. The waitress appears, delivering the chicken they had ordered. Hong asks if the protagonist had nothing to say. Jae asks them to stop doing that. The man asks when it was because he was just getting started. Jae asks if that person wasn't the girl. He says he wouldn't confuse her with anyone else. He thinks she wasn't foolish enough to take the identity of some random guy and leave everything to luck. Around the year 2024, parameters for dead or missing people with that man's surname were added. These parameters captured everyone involved with him. Since that person was an old man, he only referred to people by their surnames and didn't care about their genders. One of them was abroad and another died during an attempt to prevent the invasion of the Jiangsang dungeon. Lastly, he was an officer before the awakening. Reports stated that the old man had worked with him on multiple cases. The records disappeared because he was working undercover and never returned. An unlucky hunter dreamed of doing what was right. Soon after, the scene returns to the protagonist talking with Hong. He asks who that person was and if he hadn't killed someone just to test him. Hong says he found that in the Sompa district dungeon. They said that dungeon was guarded all day, but they had no idea that he had ended up getting hurt in that place. For that reason, he wants to ask Ja if he really knew anything about that. Ja questions if Hong wanted his help and that's why he tested him. Kim in turn says she didn't understand anything they had been talking about from the start. She asks who that person was and why they were so extremely important. Ja, observing the girl, assumes she was probably drunk. He asks if she knew that he was from ARCS. Kim says he never said that directly, but only an idiot wouldn't notice after the mess he made at the training field. The protagonist is surprised as Hong hadn't explained anything to the girl so far. Time passes and the protagonist explains everything that had happened. Kim, apparently drunk, asks if the suspicions had ended for the protagonist. Hong in turn seems to accept and apologizes to the boy. He says that all those cards could be his. In addition, there was an ID. The details were filled in according to what he had said at the investigation office. It didn't matter if it was a lie because he would have to live with it. What he was handing over to him was a hunter's license. For now, it was only Class D, which couldn't prove as time went by. Besides that, he received his bank book, which was the verification card. He noticed that his payday had already passed. Jae asks if that amount was correct. Hong replies yes, because he had personally calculated. He mentions that he knew Joe was emotional, but he could check it more carefully later, so they should just eat it once. Hearing what the man had said, the protagonist is surprised. He wonders if his face looked like someone emotional about his actions, and if they wouldn't even let him explore the dungeon. Even so, he should set the money issue aside. The fact that this person was giving him these things meant something. Thus, he finally gave up teasing Ja and accepted that he was one of the poor kids from ARC. Ja, handing over a paper, says that it was one of the rumors floating around about that person mentioned earlier. For that reason, he should take a look. Hong observes its surprise, and the protagonist responds that it was ARC's research center, a branch made to recruit new members in secret. Hong asks why they were doing that, and if it was like a cult. Ja replies that they were doing it to gather as many people as possible, so they could choose from among them. Or maybe they were looking for good test subjects. One of the objectives of that place was to create a method for artificial awakening. Hong wonders what he was talking about. The protagonist is surprised because he really didn't know that. He asks why he thought people were kidnapping children. It was to increase the number of test subjects. Hong replies that it could be a worldwide crime syndicate, and the boy says he wasn't wrong. However, 2 years ago, an acquaintance of his was dispatched to the United States. The team that was transferred had been wiped out. To recover his body, he followed their tracks and heard about that place for the first time at a black market in South America. As he researched further, he could see it wasn't a small organization. There were several cases of massacres in dungeons and even criminal awakenings. They were involved in all kinds of crimes. Hong says that all the countries where they were found were being investigated in secret. Che thinks that now he was starting to understand. ARC was just part of an organization. They had sections that took care of the background and research. Then Kim asks if she could say what room that was. However, the boy replies that he had never seen it before. Hong questions if there were runes he really didn't know. The protagonist asks how he could remember all those that even Zhu didn't know. However, there was one thing he could do. He claims that at least he could figure out what type of room it was. Time passes and Kim seems to be in a car saying it was lunchtime. The protagonist's students seem to be crazy and starving. Kim is surprised and asks what had happened to those kids. Jay asks if she brought the things he had requested. The girl replies yes. Handing over a Astera's Cardiano asterisk, Jay says she could draw it that way and then stick it. He asks if that was the rune that was in the picture. However, there seemed to be several. Kim says she didn't know why they were in such a hurry. However, they were careless with it, so she had to draw it in several versions. She asks if the boy couldn't do it, but he tells her to stop talking nonsense and just start drawing. Meanwhile, the students seem to still be eating. Kim finishes drawing. She says she thought it would be something grander since they were doing tests. Right after, another boy shows up asking what the teacher was doing. He mentions that it was a rune he hadn't learned and asked why she had stuck it on the meat. The protagonist replies that it was something he had to test. The boy asks if he was trying to create a new rune, so that must have been why they looked so similar. The young man responds that Teacher Kim is still going to eat and that he should stop bothering and go somewhere else. Changing the subject, the guy asks if the director really hadn't come back yet. Kim says he was taking too long. At that moment, the young man notices something strange. He asks if Jay was also sensing that strange smell. The protagonist then seems to realize something. Those people from ARK were using runes to feed the dungeons with rotten meat. Right after, the scene cuts to before the protagonist's regression in his teenage years. He asks Parahong if he thought it was a good idea to have a hunter's license. The guy says he didn't know he wanted to become one. He asked if the school had said something and if by any chance they were bullying him. Because if that were the case, they would go to the office immediately. The boy responds that the issue was that there was a lot of competition in the public exam. Hong says he could get him a spot. However, the protagonist says he thought someone wanted to be taken to another hearing. That's why he asked why he wanted to know if he could get additional points for having a hunter's license. Hong wasn't sure about that. The young man questions if he wasn't the most influential person in the management agency. The man replies that yes, but he wasn't in charge of recruitment, so he would look for some information. Then he should get the license first. Jay says that sounded like a hassle. He was thinking of getting a rank E. However, Hong replies that he was his son. For that reason, he couldn't stay in that rank. But Jay responds that he didn't inherit his ability because he was adopted. Patting his head, Hong says that he really couldn't beat him. Thus, the scene cuts to the present. Hong says there was a person inside that dungeon. Although found dead, there really was a person in that place. Then it said that they would investigate it. For that reason, they had to wait for now. The more they pursued them, the more uncertainties they would have. So they would focus on preparing for the dungeon field training. The protagonist says that with his skills, even rank D would be considered support. He questions where he got that from. Hong asks what he was talking about. The protagonist was going with him. To Hong, he was more than enough. However, Jay comments that if he was going to make the protagonist work so much, he should raise his salary. Hong replies that running the store was quite expensive and that he had many responsibilities. Besides, they were going to build a new building soon. Since there were several dungeons in the area, the construction company would only accept the job if the price were higher. The protagonist says he just needed to clear the dungeons, and Hong replies that's exactly why he was going. Jack questions if it wouldn't be faster if Hong cleared the dungeons by himself. He replies that no. Even so, in the end, they needed to show results. The school he had founded with his name was facing criticism. Many believe that hunters didn't need a school. For that reason, they should present more evident results. If it were a woman in his place, people wouldn't consider that an adequate result. The number of awakened individuals was increasing, but the number of victims was also constantly growing. The hunters were becoming more and more out of control, and their skills were stagnating, which worsened the situation. That's why the school wouldn't fail if it managed to protect the newly awakened ones. He mentions that there's an easier way to solve the situation. They could announce that they are teaching runes only at the school. The scene shifts to the classroom. The students are surprised to hear that they would explore a real dungeon. Hong says it's been 3 months since the school opened, and it was time for a test. The protagonist would accompany them in a dungeon. Jay explains that the field training day would be the next day. They would enter a rank C dungeon near the school. Jay would accompany them, but would only intervene in extreme situations. From that moment on, the students would be required to form groups and learn 4 important lessons. Only after discovering the answers that were on the board could they start forming a team and planning a strategy. The place they were going was similar to Earth, but due to dimensional distortions, there would be extraordinary situations. For that reason, they should prepare to face things they had never seen before. Meanwhile, a girl seemed very shaken. A flashback of a person who could be her father appears. He says she would become a mage and the protagonist recognizes her. He asks if she wasn't going out to eat, but the girl seems to be crying. The protagonist suggests that this is enough for a light explanation and proposes that they eat. Soon, the girl calls for Ja. She says that she really wants to leave that school. For her, it didn't matter how she thought about it. She believed she had no talent and was not qualified to be a mage. Before she became a burden, she needed to leave immediately. The protagonist, surprised, wonders what happened and what the problem was. He believes someone probably said something wrong to her. The girl replies that wasn't the case. She just didn't have the talent to use magic. Jay asks what she's talking about as her casting speed was faster than most active agents. He asks if she thinks Jiang couldn't use magic, but the girl replies he had nothing to do with it, because he only awakened half a year ago and she awakened more than 10 years ago. Besides, she could only use a single spell. She asks how she could call herself a mage when she could only use one formula. Then the protagonist asks where she learned magic. The girl replies it was before her grandfather's death. So the protagonist asks if he can know what her attribute was. Sometime later, the scene shifts to the protagonist discussing with Hong. They talk about Seo-hyun wanting to give up. Hearing what the girl had said, the protagonist smiles. He mentions that he had spoken with her before. She replied that she thought she really had no talent. That's why it motivated her to become an archmage. Hong replies that her standards were too high. Her grandfather had been a very renowned mage, so he had never met a man stricter than him. Jay asks if Hong met the man personally. Hong replies that he met his son, who was her father. The last time he saw her grandfather was when his son died. At that time, he dissolved the guild to take care of his granddaughter. After that, he only heard about the funeral. He was terribly hard on his son, but seemed to have been kinder to his granddaughter. The protagonist thinks that this is common among mages. Forcing their children to follow the path they desire after losing a child is normal. Then Jay asks Hong to take good care of her. Noticing Hong's reluctance, the protagonist questions what kind of response that was. Hong replies that he feels like he'll take care of her, even if he does nothing. He then starts to leave the room. He says Jade expected something like that from a magic teacher. Jay asks since when Hong has been a teacher. Hong replies that everyone already considered him one. Once again, Jay asks to increase his salary if they wanted to make him a teacher. Hong replies that lunchtime is over and that he should be on his way. Standing up, the protagonist says he will go talk to his class. He states that he is sure Hong will take care of the rest, that it's the kids who aren't mages. Desperate, Hong begs the protagonist not to do that. He really doesn't want to do it. Soon, the scene shifts to the classroom. Jay asks what they want to discuss. He asks one of the students if he thinks he can survive in a dungeon. The boy replies that they should worry more about survival than the attack itself. Jay is surprised and says he didn't expect such a good answer at this moment, so they should change the topic. The boy asks why he made them think so much. He says he ended up feeling bad from doing it so much. The protagonist asks if he really did that or if he's fine, because in the first place, they were all useless. A hunter needs to know their weaknesses and find ways to compensate for them. The boy asks where they should start because he's very confused. Soon, Jay asks if they know what their magic elements are. There's nothing more subject to changes in value in society than mages. Even now, they are the most valued. But once the runes for choosing mana and the pens are developed, that value will drop drastically. As a result, mages are cornered. That's why they made a gamble. Thus, the countless magical researches of society have already disappeared. They began trying all sorts of strange things to pass their elements onto their children. An archmage in France who could no longer bear to see innocent children suffer studied how mana worked. He revealed to the public how to discover one's element. As a result, mages learned his method. They analyzed their children to keep those who had the same element and abandon those who didn't. Thus, they sent them to the Hunter Academy. Soon after, the protagonist asked them to use that to check their elements. Kim asks if the only way to know their elements was when they felt them for themselves. Ja replies that it was a method developed by room mages. Curious, the girl asks if they should try. The steps to know the elements of an awakened mage are as follows. First, the dwarf gold powder, which amplifies mana, should be mixed in clean water, using this mixture to measure the blood and increase efficiency. Then the swan feather that protects the horde and the stance should be dipped. Lastly, the feather should be filled with mana. Thus, a light begins to envelop the feather. At the same moment, several roots start emerging. Jay asks if they had paid attention, stating that it wasn't difficult. The girl, desperate, asks who that mage was and how he knew so much, finding it incredible. She begs him not to play dumb, pleading for him to tell her everything. However, Jay replies that the boy who performed that experiment had already died. For that reason, the other students should try it soon. Next, another girl grabs the feather. She says nothing happened, but the protagonist asks her to keep pouring her mana. At that moment, the feather begins to turn black. The girl asks what that was, and the protagonist responds that he knew the problem was her element. He states that her element was darkness, the opposite of light. It wasn't that she wasn't good enough for her love, but their elements were completely different, and that's why they didn't match. Then the girl suggests her colleague should also try. Jinwoo says he will give it a try. The protagonist replies that his element was fire, so he should drop the feather immediately or an accident could happen. Jinwoo asks what his actual element was. Jae responds that his element was light. Soon after, the scene cuts to the girl talking to Jae, saying she had been thinking about something. She states that it's true she couldn't use her love's magic. Even if it wasn't Jinwoo, that wouldn't change, so she decided to see everything from a different perspective. Thus, she came to a conclusion. Jae responds that it's a shame she couldn't use light magic. However, he wouldn't want her grandfather's magic to be forgotten. The girl mentions that Miss Cheeman told her how other spells were lost that way, and because of that, it all seemed like a waste. For that reason, now she wanted to become Jinwoo's teacher. Observing the girl, the protagonist thinks that she came to that place seeking a perfect solution. He asks if she really wants to teach all of her grandfather's spells. The girl replies yes, she didn't want her grandfather's magic to disappear, but she also didn't want to teach it to just anyone. Jae asks if she was sure about teaching that boy, considering they hadn't known each other for long. The girl replies that she was sure. Jae mentions that her feelings might change once she really saw the magic in action, and that she should think it over. The girl says she might need to see someone else using the magic to finally move on. Jae thinks she wasn't as traumatized as he had imagined. He assumes that because she was young, she recovered quickly. Or maybe he himself had a hidden talent for guidance, or even a simple word of encouragement could change everything. Either way, it was already resolved. Soon after, the scene cuts to the girl asking if Ju wanted to learn the magic. The boy replies that no, but he had nothing against it. However, becoming her student was a bit much. Kim says he didn't know what that meant. The boy replies that he understood because he was also a mage and was aware of everything. Even though it was a great opportunity, he didn't want to do it. The protagonist then asks why. Ju replies that even though it was a good opportunity, it was a bit extreme to treat his friend as a teacher. Jae is surprised, wondering if that was really all. Ju says he was aware that this was the only opportunity of his life. Even so, this was also about how important that magic was to the girl. Still, he wasn't sure if he was really good enough to handle it all. And he didn't want to see the girl disappointed in him or blaming herself. Nor did he want to overburden himself trying to keep up with her. Moreover, he didn't want things to get awkward between them. He also didn't have grand ambitions like becoming an archmage or anything like that. Being a regular mage was already good enough for him. Then the protagonist says that everything was settled, so they should take a break. As he starts to leave, Kim is surprised and asks if the boy was really going to give up on everything. She questions if he shouldn't get to know the potential of his unique magic. However, the protagonist says he already knew that. Asking the girl if she thought Jinwoo was really as untalented as she believed, Kim replies that it was hard to say as talent in magic was very distinct. It was difficult to explain to a mage. With common magic, one should gain control with dedication, time, and effort, but that doesn't mean it would work with unique magic. Someone who couldn't use common magic might have an epiphany and become an archmage in a matter of seconds. In simple terms, it was all about luck. Regarding Jinwoo, she mentions that he wouldn't know anything unless he tried. She also says it's not good to put limits on oneself. She understands his feelings, but carrying the legacy left by a friend's grandfather could be bad. That could be a huge burden for the boy. She asks if the girl had explained why she wanted to teach Jinwoo. The protagonist observes the situation and thinks that his own adolescence wasn't peaceful. That's why he was lost in that situation. A flashback of Han appears where he says he would support the protagonist on any path he wanted to follow. If he wanted to go to the academy or work at the company, it would be fine. If someone bullied him, he would take care of them. However, the protagonist says he didn't need any of that. Hong asks if the boy hated him. He mentions that he was human too, and that it hurt him. However, the boy asks him to stop all of that. Hong, disappointed, asks if he really hated him, but the protagonist responds that it wasn't that. Returning to the present, the protagonist thinks that he hadn't even been testing his limits, so he couldn't complain. It wasn't like he could repeat this with his own children. However, he could comfort them directly, as he had done. He calls the girl and says that Ji-hoon had said he didn't want to learn. The girl is very surprised by what she hears. Jae responds that Ji-hoon didn't hold any hard feelings toward her, but he didn't think he was worthy. He also didn't think he had the talent to be her student. He said he couldn't face her or anything like that. The girl asks if this happened even after Ji tried to persuade him. Jae says that's how the other guy felt and asks what he could do. Anyway, she was already his student and he was her student, so that would be her primary task as a teacher. She should be honest and convince her student. Then the girl tears up a piece of paper. At that moment, she starts to eat it. Content, she says she would really do it. A flashback appears from the protagonist's past life with Hong. Hong says they need to talk. However, the young man responds that there's nothing for them to talk about. He says he wasn't really Hong's son. Anyway, Hong is surprised by what he hears. Then he kneels down and states that the boy was his true son. Jae asks if that was because of the adoption. He says Hong shouldn't worry as he would step aside when he became an adult. Moreover, he asks Hong to stop repeating his name as it shouldn't be spoken by him. He states that he was different from Hong's son. and that they shouldn't be confused. He mentions that he seemed more like a stray dog that Hong had found. Then Hong says he didn't take the protagonist to replace anyone. Hong states that he ran away from the orphanage when he was 19 at the moment he awakened. That day, he saw himself in the protagonist's face. For that reason, he wanted the boy not to follow the same path he had. Having Ja, Hong says that he had thought a lot, but he couldn't define what kind of person he really was. The scene then cuts to the present, with Kim saying the same thing that Hong had said before. The protagonist responds that he would call that more of affection. Kim replies that she wouldn't disagree with him, asking if Jinwoo hadn't exceeded in that way. Jia responds that he had just interpreted it that way for him. It was all due to his experience. Those kids are quite emotional, so they become very unstable with the slightest push. Jinwoo was worried about the possibility of disappointing the girl. For that reason, they just needed to form a bond where disappointment wouldn't matter. Then the scene cuts to Jinwoo, who says he hadn't said it was for that reason. He states that he would give it his all. 2 days later, the scene cuts to Jinwoo calling that girl teacher. The protagonist, observing the situation, thinks that everything was a mess. Even so, he feels a little better seeing those kids studying. Meanwhile, 2 boys in the background seem to be training. A man comments that the only person who had been cut was him. Lee says it was no use, as excuses like that wouldn't bring his head back. Jess says those people didn't need to be so loud. Then Lee asks the protagonist who had won the battle. Kim responds that they should play rock, paper, scissors to decide the winner. Soon after, Kim arrives as well. The other girl asks if what she brought was what she had promised. Kim replies that it was a standard student contract. She mentions that she used to use that model, so they should edit it to fit their situation. She apologizes for the books being so short, saying she learned that from her father. Ju asks if they wrote contracts between family members. Jeff responds that lawsuits happen all the time between teachers and students. Kim says he should be grateful if everything ends in just a lawsuit, as there was even a stabbing recently. She tells them that they made a niece do whatever they wanted for 10 years using magic. That woman would likely be considered innocent. The girl says that if there's any problem with her, they should let her know immediately because she will do her best to resolve it. However, Ju responds that it seemed like a big deal, and he didn't understand what it meant. He says he just wanted to know if everyone was okay with what was being discussed. Then Kim asks if they weren't going to write a contract. The other girl replies that they were going to. However, it didn't need something so complicated and began signing a document. Thus, all the rules of the teaching were presented. Sometime later, everything was finished. Kim is surprised and asks if that was really the contract. The girl responds that it was all that was needed. She asks if Ju wanted to add anything else. Ju replies that he wasn't very familiar with it and asks if an advisor could be a student. He states that they should feel free to teach more talented people at any time. Kim says they should make sure to include more specific details instead of being so generic. She comments that they should know this was a legal bond. The other girl responds that they expected Kim to act as the notary, and with the approval of a great mage, they wouldn't have any more problems. Ja, observing the situation, thinks that they could consider it a learning experience if they betrayed each other. Then another girl calls Ja. She says she heard that 3 witnesses is a good number, so she asks for his signature along with the directors. Our protagonist starts signing the paper. He thinks that, aside from him, no one would be able to overlook that contract. Sometime later, time passes, and the protagonist seems to be alone in that place. He thinks that everything was indeed so calm. However, he wonders why that was happening, and if everything was really so good, why could the world come to an end in 20 years? Right after, the scene cuts to Hong, who says everything was being investigated by Hunter Lee. He mentions that there would soon be a practical test and asks how the kids were doing. The protagonist responds that he wasn't sure about the other kids as he was only responsible for the magic class. Hong asks how he could be so cold since, as a teacher, he should look after all the children. Additionally, he comments that the protagonist wasn't doing much as the runes classes were suspended. The kids needed to prepare for the test, and in any case, it was the other girl who taught. The protagonist says that's why he was helping take care of all the children whenever he had the chance. Hearing what the boy said, Hong smiles and asks him to keep working hard. Sometime later, Jay thinks that even though his senses as a hunter were terrible, there was a reason for that restlessness. He wonders if it's because he didn't have any work to do. He thinks that maybe there was someone who balanced work and life better than he did. Then the protagonist meets Ja, who seems happy because he had really managed to do it. He asks if the teacher was also seeing it, as that was the girl's grandfather's magic. Observing everything, the protagonist is surprised and asks if that was a unique magic. However, the girl responds that it wasn't, as it was the magic her grandfather frequently used to light up dark places. But since it also revealed hidden things, it was useful for avoiding traps. For that reason, it was an excellent magic. She asks if the boy didn't think so as well. At that moment, Hong appears, seemingly pleased with what he had seen. Soon after, Jay calls the girl, asking how she was doing with the mana analysis. The girl responds that she was working on it. The protagonist asks if the teacher hadn't taught her how to do that. Right after, the girl falls silent, saying she couldn't understand it very well, even though it was her mana. She comments that it was so different from what her grandfather had explained. Jay, on the other hand, is surprised, thinking it was impressive how she was able to imitate light magic with such a different type of mana. He asked her not to think of it in such a complicated way. Also, she shouldn't be too attached to the concept of light and shadow, but think of it as an element. Asking if she was good with basic magic, the girl responds that it was completely different. Then Jay kneels down, saying that the part about using magic remained the same. The boy digs a hole and asks her to fill it with water, asking if she could produce basic magic. At that moment, the girl begins to invoke a spell. The protagonist asks her to boil the water. The girl does as he requested. Right after, Jay asks her to stop, asking if she understood what had happened. He explains that she should think about why she was able to use light magic, which is the opposite of shadow. He says he wasn't sure, since he was a mage. However, he comments that water and fire are opposite elements, but their formulas were still different. So sometimes it's possible to create an opposite effect just by reversing a formula. He says that now she should start from that teaching. The rest she would have to figure out on her own. If she didn't understand something, she should ask Professor Kim. However, she responds that she couldn't do that, as she only wanted to ask the protagonist. Jay responds that he had already said before that he wasn't a mage. He thinks that for some reason something about her becomes scary when her bangs cover her face. Originally, there were supposed to be 10 children in the first generation of Academy students, but of those, only 8 remained. In the original timeline, he wasn't sure how many had dropped out after that incident, and even now, the classroom didn't seem modified. So it remained as it was in the original timeline. Until then, only anxious students had left, but originally they should have fought for a few more years before changing the name to Hunter Academy. To be honest, the new name sounded worse, but they kept talking about it, remembering the dead students or something like that. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the protagonist in the classroom apparently analyzing a student. Then Jay calls her, saying that she really lacked concentration. He comments that, as a hunter, she should be able to stay focused regardless of the situation. He asks if healers didn't go to dungeons, and for that reason, she should do it again. Right after, the boy remembers something, asking how her younger sister was doing, as he heard she went to speak with the director to register as a fully awakened person. Then the guy notices her hesitation and asks what the problem was. She responds to not bring that up, as she didn't know where she got those ideas from. She comments that she barely managed to stop herself from stepping on the ice before school. And she was talking about things like keeping her feet cold and circulating mana, or whatever, since she really did all sorts of random things. Observing the situation, he was about to ask if that was why he had been feeling uneasy for the past few days. He assumes that's why she hadn't mentioned anything about the buildup in her veins. He thinks she might end up being dragged to one of those indoctrination training centers. But even so, he couldn't lose a future slave like her. For that reason, he had to be cautious about things like that. Right after, a flashback from the protagonist's life appears again. He says he had taken a look at his homework and what was written about his profession. He asks what that was and already refers to himself as a hunter, not even knowing what it was. Hong replies that he just wanted to hear an explanation from him. The boy says he just wanted a stable job. Besides, he didn't want people telling him what to do. That's why he would climb the ranks to be able to boss others around. Hong asks where he had heard those words, and the boy responds that he had seen them on the news. He says he would become a public servant instead. So he didn't want to become president because it was too much work, and he just wanted to be a middle manager who could pass the responsibility on to others. Additionally, he heard that a public servant's salary was low, but there was nothing to be done. Hearing what the boy said, Hong is surprised. He says it's fine if that's what the boy wants, so he will allow him to do what he wishes. Right after, the scene cuts again. The protagonist is a bit younger when his aunt asks why he hadn't enrolled in the academy. The boy replies that it's because he was going to become a public servant, not a hunter. Surprised, his aunt says that's ridiculous and asks if his master knew about that. She asks the boy to go train with her. However, he responds that he couldn't because he had an exam next week. But she replies that if he became a hunter, he wouldn't have to take any more exams. The protagonist replies that he would end up becoming an idiot like her. Soon after, the scene cuts to a bit further in the future. The protagonist says it seems like they had cleared the dungeon with great difficulty. He says that if they reach reality after working under that hunter, they should know they were prepared to become real hunters. He asks why they wanted to become hunters and why they continued their careers in that field. For that reason, they should reflect on that. However, another man asks why the protagonist hadn't become a hunter. The boy, with a smile, replies that he didn't like fighting. Moreover, he didn't like that it was such an ignorant job. Again, the scene cuts but now into the present. As he walked down the street, he thinks that he suddenly found himself at that girl's middle school from before. He wonders what he should really do. When he looks ahead, he notices something. He still had that paper. In turn, he's surprised, wondering if she still had that nonsense. Then another woman appears, asking if the girl was interested in that. She states that she was also from that place, and if the girl wanted, they could discuss it elsewhere. Moreover, she mentions that she needed to learn from a specialist to avoid getting hurt. Soon after, Jay seems desperate about something and starts running frantically toward the girl. At that moment, she notices him and asks what he was doing. The other woman is surprised, asking if he was the teacher of that Numa. Jay asks who she was, and the woman apologizes, saying she wasn't just some random person. She hands him her card and reveals that she's from the National Association of an agency called New Spirit. She says she's sure he could tell what they did just by looking at her. She mentions that they conducted various activities for children, from fieldwork to summer camps. Many people were struggling those days with so many dungeon breaks happening. As a result, they offered counseling during their activities. People who work with children always drop by, so they regularly visit looking for the best ways to treat a child properly. She's aware there are many strange places in that cruel world, but she assures him they weren't those kinds of people. Additionally, they had several branches across the country and also received support from some government entities. Then Jay begins to analyze that paper. Soon after, he calls out to the girl, asking if her sister hadn't told her to go straight home. For that reason, she should go immediately. With tears on her face, the girl begins to leave. The protagonist says he thought the woman wasn't going to let the girl go. The woman comments that if he listened to a few kind words, he could help his student as well. She thinks that girl had found a teacher who was an easier target than a 16-year-old girl. She asks him to take a look at those documents because they were the association's information. They were all their sponsors, and she was sure some of them were quite well known. She mentions that they did this for everyone. Jai, observing that, remains silent. He comments that honestly, he wasn't a teacher and somehow ended up working with this, as it was originally something else. He asks if she had heard of the hunter training model in schools. Interrupting Jai's speech, the woman says she saw it on TV and asks if he was a teacher at that school. The boy then replies that yes, considering many children suffered in their childhoods, it wasn't an easy job. The woman says she understands, so he must have gone through many difficult moments. She asks if he was a hunter, and Jay replies that yes, but not a high-ranked one. The woman says that wasn't important, as what mattered most was his dedication to the students. She asks if he could buy a cup of coffee from that shop. That way, they could talk a little more, and she could listen to his explanations. Additionally, they could discuss how he could better educate his students. A novice and a young low-rank hunter, who unexpectedly became a model teacher less than a month ago. He still felt strange being called a teacher, but his concern for the students was genuine. He cared deeply for his students and was directly connected to the strongest hunter in South Korea, who was watching over them. For that reason, there was no better company for his group. Soon after, the scene cuts to the protagonist discussing with Hong about the National Association Against Spirit. Hong asks why he is holding that paper. The boy responds that an old lady handed it to him on the street, and he took it while she was cornering Hyun's younger sister. Hong asks if he was talking about that girl from before, and the protagonist responds yes. He asked if he should keep an eye on her, since he was the guardian. Hong comments that technically, he was more of a substitute guardian. Jay mentions that it was easy to trick her after saying he was concerned about the children's mental health. She even gave him a lesson plan and suggested he attend in his free time. Hong asks if he's asking for permission to contact that association and ends up accepting the boy's offer. Jay says he really wanted to get in touch because since he talked with that woman, he realized that someone else could pose as him. They had said they were teachers at the hunter school. Hong, in turn, tells him to keep doing it. However, the protagonist remembers that he still had that thing on his leg. Hong says that if he let them know beforehand, everything would go smoothly. Noticing Jay's hesitation, Hong asks if there's a problem. Jay responds that it's nothing. He's just not used to that kind of situation, because sneaking around like that and gathering more information wasn't his job. Hong asks why he's acting that way, and the protagonist responds that it's because he doesn't have the talent for it. Right after, an awkward silence occurs and Hong starts laughing at the boy. Irritated, he asks if the joke was over. Hong responds that this type of work was what he used to do at ARC. Jai replies that he did nothing more than some household tasks. Hong questions if he had never infiltrated somewhere to gather information. The boy responds that wasn't his normal job. Standing up, the man says that Erisi had no idea about that. Even so, he tells Jay not to worry and just observe what they were discussing. However, the protagonist replies that he had already said he couldn't do that. Hong says he told him not to worry about it because seeing how he had the kids in the palm of his hand, he would do just fine. Additionally, he was more than capable, asking if he would be okay. If he came into contact with someone from ARC, they might recognize him. Even so, he should have a plan to deal with that, as he was walking around freely and could run into someone at any moment. That's why he needed to have a plan in place. However, that wasn't the protagonist's idea. He comments that back then they used masks so few people could recognize his face. Hong tells him not to overdo it and to just get it done, because there were other ways and he shouldn't do anything risky. Furthermore, he should use his cell phone while he was there. Hong is surprised, as in the 21st century, the boy didn't have a cell phone. The protagonist responds that he was preparing some lesson plans that day. Hong asks what that was, and Jed questions how it was possible to teach children without a lesson plan, because at the very least he should teach them about monsters' weaknesses and raid processes. The man responds that he wasn't good at explaining those things. Jay says that if he thought others could be good at it, he should also be more than capable. At that moment, Hong starts running away from the place. The protagonist says that he was the director, so he couldn't run away like that. Thus, June 15 arrives and it was time for raid training in a dungeon. Kim, observing the situation, asked if the protagonist wasn't being too relaxed about it all. since he was barely wearing any armor. She asks what his rank was because if he was an illegal awakened, he should have some idea. Jae asks if she had seen his license as he was really a ranked E. Kim says that was true because that was the only way Artsu wouldn't be suspicious of him. She mentions that Mizun went through a lot of trouble creating her background. Jade asks what kind of person can create an entire life for someone else in just a few days. Kim responds that the girl had said it was better not to know about that. She asks if he thought the kids would be able to succeed in the raid. Ja comments that Mizun's guild had cleared that dungeon before, so if they couldn't manage the attack, they should stop being hunters. Kim says he hadn't even taught them how to choose a leader. The protagonist asks how many of them had already been in a dungeon and could teach that. Even so, some of them were part of guilds. Besides, they weren't careless when it came to dungeons. Jay, surprised, asks if that man from before was really part of a guild. He thinks that he might have been a slave despite being a victim. He had acted like an idiot, scared of the guild, and had been stabbed twice. Soon after, Kim removes the protagonist's leg prosthesis, stating that she would take good care of the children. Right after, the scene cuts to all the students preparing to enter the dungeon. The protagonist recognizes the man from before, saying he was the fat one. He declares that this time he'll make sure he becomes a person instead of an animal. Then, the scene cuts to a woman greeting the protagonist, saying her name was Seo Jong, and that she was affiliated with the dungeon management office. Shortly after, the protagonist introduces himself, stating his name. The girl says it was a pleasure to meet him and asks if he had prepared the documents for the raid. The young man then pulls out a paper and says it was the dungeon raid report. The protagonist, observing the girl, thinks she looked very familiar. For that reason, he must have seen her at some point before. Noticing him staring, the girl asks if something was wrong. Jay responds that it was nothing, just that he was a little nervous about the raid. The girl asks if Hunter Hong had bragged about the student's abilities. Jay replies that even so, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Then Hong appears, asking why Jay always treated him like an idiot. The girl says she wouldn't treat him like an idiot if he did things the right way. The protagonist, observing the situation, seems to recognize that voice. He says she was the chief auditor on the day they attacked the research lab. He supposes he never thought he would see her again, as he went through a lot of difficulties at that time, but still retired without problems. Soon after, the girl comments that usually hunters are sent to take care of those situations. However, they didn't have anyone available to do that. Hong then asks if it would really be necessary to call other hunters when he was there with Auditor Kim. The girl responds that it was just standard procedure. A discussion among them begins, while the students watch everything. Interrupting the argument, Jay asks everyone to enter the dungeon at once. The boy begins giving some information, saying that 9 members in total were entering, including the students and the teacher and the school model, along with the hunters. He mentions the names of all the students and says that the exact time was 10:12 a.m., so they would enter immediately. Soon after, the scene cuts to everyone already inside the dungeon, and the protagonist asks for everyone's attention. He says he will provide any assistance and evaluate them based on how much they contribute during the raid. Lee asks how the test results would affect them. The protagonist responds that he would start with the lowest score, so they would have a private meeting with the director and remedial classes with him afterward. The lower the score, the more time they would spend with him. For that reason, they should stop talking and now rely on their own luck. Jay disappears into the bushes. Another student observing the situation asks what they should do. Everyone starts gathering to discuss a strategy. One of the students says that according to the exploration reports, the dungeon core was located to the east of the forest. To get there, they would have to face the goblins first. They ask if everyone remembers the characteristics of those monsters. Another student asks where the rune that hides mana was. The girl responds that it was in that location, so they should head toward it. Meanwhile, Jay was observing everything, thinking it was a bit frustrating to stay hidden just watching. The dungeon was a forest type, so there weren't trees everywhere around. Even goblins had the intelligence of a child, so they would bring fire to put out a blaze. However, there was no lake in that place, so his only option was to set the place on fire. If they noticed that, they would probably win with 100% certainty. However, it was clear that most people, or maybe no one, would think that way. Meanwhile, the students were still defeating the monsters. Soon, they realized they were about to be cornered. One of the students asked the mages to activate the shields. Another boy seemed very desperate, but at that moment, a girl activated her magic. The boy asked them to finish them off. Then another boy defeated all the monsters and the battle came to an end. The student asked them to check if all the monsters were dead, questioning if that had been the third attack. He wanted to know how everyone's runes were doing. The girl mentioned they had just checked, and that's why nothing went wrong. Soon, they would reach the core. There are rare cases where the location of a rank C dungeon core changes, so they shouldn't let their guard down. Another student asked if this wasn't a bit easy for a rank C dungeon. He asked if the other girl had ever been in such a dungeon. She replied that she had been with her grandfather before, so she only went to rank at dungeons. Another girl responded that she had been with her master in a rank C dungeon for training sessions, but since it was just training, it was easy compared to other dungeons. Meanwhile, the protagonist observed everything and thought they were being too confident. A student commented that even with someone watching them, the director wouldn't send them to a dungeon that was impossible to clear. The protagonist was surprised as that guy had never referred to him as a teacher. The student said that when they entered the place, they had checked all the monsters nearby, so they would probably clear most of them to make it easier. Considering that goblins always moved in groups, the largest number they had seen together was 8. That meant they couldn't intervene unless the situation became dangerous. That was just a bluff to make them nervous. Worse a bet that the protagonist was hiding in a tree nearby. Meanwhile, the protagonist was indeed watching from the bushes. He thought that even if that dungeon was easy, it wasn't hard to increase the difficulty. For that reason, he was going to teach them why they shouldn't have controlled their tongues. Unfortunately, most of the world's tragedies start with dungeon breaks. Soon after, someone asked if that kid was okay and if he had just woken up. She also wanted to know what his name was. He replied that his name was Hill. The man asked if Hill wanted to visit the guild later, as it would be a waste not to use the ability he had awakened. Besides, he said they wouldn't charge the training fee. Instead, he would just need to complete some missions using the guild's IP. That way, he would be a successful hunter in the future. It didn't take long for that boy to understand the meaning behind those eyes. Thus, the boy's life turned into hell. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another man. He thought he heard that he had been swept away by the monsters while saving him there, so he should thank the protagonist. Soon after, the boy noticed him. He said he thought that reading about runes must have been very difficult for him. Instead of an evaluative look toward a student, it was as if he were observing an inanimate object and assessing the whole body. Then the scene cuts back to the dungeon. The girl says that the number of monsters had decreased, and the other boy replies that it was because they were getting closer to the core, so that they should act quickly and get out of that place, because even if it wasn't a difficult dungeon, you never know what excuse that person might use to reduce their points. The other girl asks if he saw when the protagonist was laughing while they were rolling in the mud, because he had said it was just an evaluation. Once she asked the director if it would be possible to reduce the training a little. The other guy replies that given the director's personality, he doubted he would listen. Besides, he probably said that she wasn't going to a dungeon to live luxuriously. He also probably said that she would see much worse things when she became a hunter, and that's why she shouldn't make a fuss about just having dust on her clothes. Soon after, the other girl noticed something and asked if they hadn't seen it too. At that moment, several monsters appeared and soon started attacking the group. The boy asked them to protect He-Won and wondered why the attack had been so sudden and what they should do to get out of that place. Shortly after, Jay appeared asking what they were doing because it was a raid, so everyone should gather. Observing Hugh, the protagonist seemed surprised. Right after, he called all his students and gave instructions for each of them to do something. Then they began the countdown and everyone did what the boy had asked. Jay thought he hadn't done much and all he did was light up the rear of the forest, which chased the monsters in a unique and directional way. He didn't do it because he was annoyed with the students, as it was an official method from the training manual distributed by the agency. He would never have done that, meaning he thought the kids wouldn't be able to handle it even now and were struggling once they were in position. Therefore, it wasn't necessary to face all the monsters, as they only needed to wait until the monsters pass and then destroy the dungeon's core to escape. The reason they split up could have been because of that other guy. Since they entered the dungeon, Hugh had been naturally giving orders and the students were following. No matter how much a leader's skill can affect whether a raid succeeds, relying on him for everything wasn't right. However, there was something more. Next, the scene cuts to the protagonist inside Hong's car asking if the dungeon invasion had failed. The boy replies that the dungeon had disappeared and the inspector confirmed that the raid was successful, asking what he was talking about. Furthermore, he said he would share the details later. Getting out of the car, Jay says that the next day he would report the final grades. However, he didn't even know if that mattered to him at the moment, saying they could leave already. Meanwhile, an awkward silence takes over the car. Jay asks Hugh if by any chance he wasn't going to leave. Soon after, Hong gets out of the car, asking them to step out so they can talk. The boy asks them to say what was on their minds. However, Hugh remains silent. The protagonist says he wasn't trying to lecture him, so if he had a problem, he should resolve it for his own good. With tears on his face, the boy says he shouldn't be allowed to become a hunter. Then the scene cuts to a flashback of the protagonist's house. Hao watches the boy and asks what that was. He had rushed to the location because Hong had said it was urgent. Hong says he was the only person who could leave the protagonist and Hai questions who that boy was. He is very surprised after learning that he was his son. As he leaves the house, Hong says he would return as soon as possible after finishing the raid and asks him to take good care of the boy. Moreover, Ji-won was also in a dungeon along with Hunter Lee. For this reason, they were going through a tough time. He thought Hugh could be the best person to take care of the boy. Thus, Hong starts leaving, asking him to take good care of his son. Watching the boy, Hugh doesn't seem pleased. Hugh, 2 years before that, graduated from the academy and, as a result, became the talk of the town in just a year. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was a very remarkable man. Returning to the present, the protagonist thinks he was a great man even in his current situation, because he was one of the most notable hunters in Korea. Then Hugh asks if she was from the management agency and what her name was. Jae says it was a pleasure to meet him since it was the first time he saw him, and his name was Ja. The guy in turn says he had heard that name before. The protagonist says they were significantly behind schedule, and for that reason, they should leave soon. However, the boy asks them not to rush, because they should leave it to him, and because of that, he would take care of everything. Soon after, he starts drinking a beverage. Jay, surprised, asks if that was alcohol and if he was crazy since they were inside the gate. Kai replies that his brain wouldn't work unless he took a sip. For this reason, it was necessary to have a drink before entering the raid. Thus, they would finish it off and then grab some drinks afterward. Next, the scene cuts to the present with Hugh still somewhat shaken. Jay, in turn, thinks he should stop crying. Right after, he calls for the boy who, with tears on his face, says he shouldn't be allowed to become a hunter. Handing him some water, Jay asks him to take a sip, thinking that it was clear and natural to need to cry sometimes. However, he really couldn't stand people who cried over everything without recognizing their own mistakes. Moreover, there was only one reason why he was going easy on him at that moment. He asks why the boy believed he shouldn't be allowed to become a hunter, thinking that he was doing all that because he needed to hide him in order to be a proper human being. Right after, Hugh says that he was sure he had already heard that he was from a guild, and when he talked about it, it seemed to be something very professional. However, he lived his live bait for a long 3 years. Observing that situation, Jay thinks he can imagine what he had gone through, because that was a typical story of someone who had grown tired of being deceived in a fraudulent contract at a very young age. But it was still something no teenager should have to experience. Continuing to speak, Jung says he swore to become a proper hunter and gathered people to form a guild. Thus, he could help people and prevent such things from happening again. However, when those monsters appeared in the dungeon, he had one single thought, that it would be much better to use those who were not useful in combat as bait. He thought he hated that guild master or anyone. However, it turned out to be a more familiar method to him. That's why he found it so repugnant. Shortly after, the protagonist starts to speak and says that he knew a guy who grew up in a similar situation, and how he had signed a contract without knowing what was best and eventually escaped with the help of some sort of smuggler. That person also wanted to help in other similar situations. Now that he thought about it, he really reminded him of that person, because he faced the same struggles. Thinking that as that boy had just opened up about his behavior, now he could understand him a bit better. Because in the end, that man could never escape his past, because his old guild and the disaster that happened left many bad memories. Moreover, Ji-won knew about his past and could have warned him a little, saying that before he thought it was funny. But even so, he continued, helping kids who went through hardships like he did. Once, the protagonist asked how the guy kept going. The guy replied that he was sure he knew it was a very rude question, saying it was funny how his father had asked him the same question. However, he should let that go because he had said it kept him up all night, asking if by any chance he was so curious that it made his insides feel twisted. Because of that, he had no choice but to answer that question, saying that he wasn't a moral person and could do worse things if he really wanted to seek efficiency. But he didn't want to do that because he didn't want to fall to the same level. For that reason, he was going to prove that he was better than that. Back to the present, the protagonist asks why the boy doesn't prove the same as well, because life was his, so he should make his own choice, asking if he knew why his former master went to jail. Count replies that he didn't, and Jay says that it was very frustrating. But even so, he should show him that he could really succeed in life. Right after, the scene cuts to the protagonist talking to Hong, saying that was what had happened. Hong questions if Jay knew how surprised he was to consider that the raid was a failure. If they couldn't clear a weakened dungeon, they couldn't be called hunters. Jay, in turn, asks if Hong didn't think they should at least receive counseling. Not just Hugh, but also the others who had been used as bait. The isolated students should be going through a tremendous amount of stress. Subjecting them to psychological counseling at least once to assess their condition would be a great idea. While eating, Hong says the food is really good. He asks what are the odds of a psychiatrist being awakened. It wasn't entirely impossible. When a hunter goes somewhere to receive counseling, the chances of an awakened psychiatrist being able to subdue the hunter were quite high. Then Kim starts to speak, saying he had heard a story from a few years ago. He mentions that a doctor was killed while counseling a hunter. Hong comments that it was clear the hunter hadn't done it intentionally. But even so, the media hounded him and judged him harshly. Park, nervous, asks if that was the reason why doctors refused to provide treatment. Kim responds that it was more than that. They wanted security measures like the use of the control unit and mana, like the one he had. Counseling could only be provided by phone call as the patient couldn't even see the professional's face. Jay, surprised, wonders if incidents of that level really existed. Hong explains that it was clear that proper treatment couldn't be offered that way. That's why hunters stopped seeking that kind of counseling. The protagonist observes that they were all kids, but Hong questions if they had licenses. Since they were all above rank D, they couldn't expect help from any specialist. If it had been truly a shocking situation, it wouldn't have followed this path from the start. Jia comments that still, they were all kids. Hong says it's not that he doesn't understand Jay's concern. He really cared about that organization. He asks if he hadn't said they were going to try to recruit him for the child psychology group. Since he's going anyway, he should pay attention to the lecture. Maybe he could gain something from it. The students were already familiar with him, and he could take the role of counselor. Considering how well he handled Hugh, he should fit in quite well. Ignoring the protagonist's responses, Hong ends up ordering another beer. The scene cuts to another day. Jay seems to be leaving a building and starts looking at his phone. Once the hunters cross the gate, they are isolated from the inner civilization. This meant that only the strongest hunters could survive. The kids would graduate in a few years, and after that, they would have to solve their own problems without help. However, there were limits. Jay thinks he never expected Hong to be so thoughtful. He was considering even the kids more than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the protagonist sees news about Hong. Soon after, Jay receives a call from the leader of the National Society team. The leader mentions he knew Jay would call. He asks where he could find a more caring teacher. He talks about a meeting for kids with trauma, believing it could help the protagonist. Then he asks what he thinks. The scene then cuts to Kim and the protagonist in a car. Kim asks if Jay is really okay with such a dull entry. He suggests they should take the car to lift their spirits. Right after, Jay gets out of the car. Kim, with a smile on his face, wishes the boy good luck. Then, Jay enters the venue. Another guy asks if he's going to the lecture. Additionally, he needed to know the boy's name. So the protagonist replies that his name was Ja. The guy mentions that team leader Jong had invited Ja. For that reason, he could go straight to the small auditorium on the second floor. He should stick that on the back of his phone and show it at the entrance. The protagonist seems surprised by something. The boy asks what the problem was, and Jay replies that it was nothing. He mentions that the boy just looked like someone he knew. As he starts walking away, Jay seems surprised, thinking that boy didn't resemble him. But even so, he was the same person. He wonders where number 3 could be after forming a lab as a failure. Supposing the boy was really living in that place now. Back then, number 3 was 15 years old and the oldest child in the lab. Since graduation and elimination were decided by the absence of 13 years in the lab, number 3 was practically an adult to the younger kids. He stayed even after that period because he was the son of a god who managed the younger children under the directors. Or maybe it was just because the director didn't like him. However, he ended up diligently encouraging the children to make mistakes with the senior. Thus, it became even easier after number 3 disappeared before turning 16. That was an unfortunate turn of events for the director. Since number 3 kept him in check, there was nothing holding him back. Even though he wasn't in good condition, he had grown somewhat attached. For this reason, he remembered feeling like an idiot because of it. He never thought he would meet that person again. Soon after, the scene cuts to another girl appearing to give a speech. The audience seems very happy with what they are seeing. The one responds that what Jay had said was correct. For that reason, they should split into groups and have a discussion at that moment. However, the protagonist didn't seem too happy with what he had heard. People begin to argue with one another. Jay, observing the situation, thinks those people might be affiliated with ARC. That was a method cults used to increase their followers. Soon after, that woman notices our boy. She asks if that was his first time, and he replies that it was. The woman says Jay should talk to them. However, Jay responds that simply listening had already helped a lot. The other girl asks what field he worked in, and Jay replies that he was a teacher. Happy, the woman replies that she was also a teacher. She states that it was the students' second period, and for that reason, they were very sensitive. At the same moment, our boy stands up, apologizing. He says he needs to go to the bathroom. While walking, the boy wonders how he could extract useful information from that group. That's why he couldn't confirm if they were really telling the truth about being affiliated with ARK. Perhaps he should try talking to the children. He still wanted to know why he should, when there was number 3, who he was sure was affiliated with ARK. Soon after, another boy appears. He asks if he could help him, or perhaps he didn't like the lecture. The protagonist thinks it seemed like he recognized him. That's why he felt a bit sad that they had spent so much time together in the lab. It made sense. Even though it was known that his adult version was a child who had traveled through time, he could immediately go to ARK and beg for his life. He asks if the boy was a volunteer, and the boy replies that he was. He was there to fulfill his volunteer hours. Although that wasn't an internal reason, because he also suffered from the dungeon break. That's why he just liked going to that place to help kids who lived through the same situation as him. The protagonist, please, says that's very kind of him. He says that he's also responsible for students with experiences similar to his. They'd all seemed fine on the outside, but were deeply broken on the inside. Soon after, an awkward silence occurs. Jay apologizes for that, and the boy says he shouldn't apologize. He liked talking about that subject. At first, he ended up hating to think about it. However, now he enjoyed talking about it because he could help other kids with the same experience he had. Jay says he hopes his students can become as strong as him. The boy says it will take a long time to get that mindset. Looking at the clock, the protagonist says he shouldn't be so impatient. That's why he should go back, because it must have been hard for him to talk about that. He asks if it was useful to him, because he was also grateful for that aspect. If he needed anything, he could contact him. He wasn't a big shot, but he was still a hunter. The boy is surprised to learn that the protagonist was a hunter. Jay, please, thinks that was exactly what he wanted to happen. Then the scene cuts to Hong talking to the protagonist. Jay says they didn't give names, only numbers. Hong asks what happened to his younger brother, and the protagonist replies that he was number 12. Irritated, Hong says they were worse than animals. the protagonist asks him to try investigating the orphanages. He heard they had a child sponsorship project, because they ended up withdrawing the children in a hurry and left some traces at the training center. That's why if they sent them to various different orphanages, it would be easier to avoid suspicion. Right after, Hong mentions that he and Kim would have to enter the dungeon in 2 days. Something urgent had come up, and for that reason, he should take good care of the students. If the dungeon was rankable, he could guarantee it would take about a week. That's why he didn't know about that aspect. Even so, he shouldn't worry because he would provide enough help. Besides, Hunter Lee had mentioned that they couldn't delay the preparation of the school's facilities any longer. Then the protagonist asks if he hadn't placed the mana control there. Hong asks if by chance he wanted to use it again, and the boy replies no. Hong says that if that's the case, he doesn't need to do it, because it's more basic to teach students without that. The protagonist asks if he could proceed with the lessons following the curriculum plans. Hong, confused, asks what that was. Jay, annoyed since he had handed that over to Hong before. Then the scene cuts to Jay teaching a class. Hong and Kim already seem to have headed toward the dungeon. Soon after, Lee asks what happened to their scores. The protagonist thinks he was very ready to criticize and separate them. However, he ends up remembering Kim saying it was already time to give them the carrot. He was sure the students already knew what they had done wrong. He asks if there really was a need to scold them, because instead of discouraging them, he should encourage them to do better next time. Besides, he should make sure to use the clothes he had handed him next time. Returning to the present, the protagonist asks the boy what he should do in preparing for a dungeon raid. Any answer was fine, so they could repeat their responses. Then he raises his hand, saying it could be the supplies. Thus, each of the students begins to give their answers. Jay responds that technically they were all correct. They were all really important. However, it's the one who reviews the dungeon information to formulate the strategy who decides on the team. Thus, he ends up determining the necessary supplies. There were 2 main reasons for their failure to clear the dungeon. The first was that they didn't appoint a captain with full authority to command the others inside the dungeon. And the second was relying too much on Hugh, because no matter how easy a dungeon seemed, they should always appoint a captain and a vice captain. In reality, this was a dungeon they should never have failed at their current level. He asks if things became easier after he reorganized their formation. For that reason, if they had kept a clear mind, even that wouldn't have been necessary. However, there was something more. Because dungeons and raids are not just about fighting well, and from now on they would teach how to use their brains. So they should think about how they would approach the situation if they were appointed captain. They would take a short break and meet in the mage's classroom. Next, the scene cuts to the protagonist talking with Mission. Mission says she was very happy to see Jai again. Then the boy asks if the dungeon had sirens. Mission asks where he had heard about that. The protagonist questions if it was true, and the girl ends up staying silent. Mission responds that yes, because it was a siren dungeon located off the coast of Soko. Additionally, it had already devoured many hunters. That place is known as the Siren's Nest. The siren enchanted the hunters because they lacked courage. All of that was because change could break her unique magic. Thus, Kim allowed herself to be attacked even knowing that it would happen. The establishment of the Skill Management Agency had its first task as director, which was to clear the Siren's Nest. Back in the present, Jaya thinks that he knew Kim's death could happen in the future. But even so, he couldn't expect a person's emotions to be purely rational. Originally, they shouldn't have been exploring the Siren's dungeon. For that reason, he felt a bit uncomfortable with it. The girl asks what was going on with him. Jaya, in turn, responds that it was nothing. Then the girl asks if by any chance he wanted to join her guild, because trying to avoid attention was useless after they publicly announced the runes. For that reason, he needed to announce them with less impact first. And if it worked, he would reveal the mana concealment rune. Having him in her guild would make controlling information easier, because if things went south, they could just deal with it under the guild's name. Jaya responds that he had no intention of joining any guild. Mission asks if it could at least be in name only. The protagonist responds that he would refuse just the same. Saying that there was no way out, Mission ends up accepting it. Jaya, in turn, is surprised by what he had seen, because he thought she would really try to convince him more. However, the girl asks what he thought she should do, because the protagonist had saved her from her younger ones. So she'd think about doing something for him, because even if Jaya ended up killing someone, she could cover for him. Right after, the scene cuts to Hong, apparently inside a dungeon. Amid that ocean, the man seemed to be somewhat attentive. Then the scene cuts to Jaya asking his students if they had thought about it during the break, because there were no right answers in dungeons. For that reason, they should think quickly to freely devise a strategy. He asks who by chance wanted to start that time. However, no one ends up raising their hand. Soon after, the protagonist says that Hugh was the captain. He asks how he would appoint the vice captain. Hao responds that it would be Hansang, because since they had seen him before, he had experience in dungeons. After that, they would proceed toward the core. Right after entering, they would use the runes prepared by their mages and begin with their formation. Additionally, the healer would stay at the front along with the mages. 15 minutes after entering, they would end up encountering the monster. For that reason, they would annihilate them, because they were monsters that moved in groups, but some could patrol individually. For that reason, they would be inside its territory. Thus, they chose to kill it quickly before it returned to its group and brought more of them. The distance between the monster and him was about 15 meters. For that reason, there were 3 trees between them, obstructing the monster's view. If the monster didn't show signs of retreating, they would get closer to get a clearer view. He would inform the rest about the monster with hand signals and end up preparing the mages. The protagonist asks what would happen if they were closer to the core. And the guy says he would first focus on adjusting their formation. He would make sure they weren't taken by them because soon he might have to deal with more monsters heading straight for them. As a consequence, they would defeat those in front and leave the others outside. Afterward, they would destroy the dungeon core before anything could happen. Hearing what the boy said, Jay begins to stare at him. Pleased with his perspective, he states that it had been very good. As a result, the raid was completed. Reliatri asks what his score was. However, the boy replies that there was no score, so everyone would have to take a turn before the class ended. He asks if Huey remembers how he named Hansung as captain. For that reason, they should try that formation. Thus, Jay asks Hansung who he would name as captain. The young man replies that it would be Huey because he was the most skilled and experienced. Jay asks what would happen if everyone entered the dungeon. Thus, they end up encountering monsters all around. Hansung says that kind of thing hadn't happened in the dungeons they invaded, and Jack questions when he said that was the dungeon they entered, because there weren't 2 dungeons existing in that place. Besides, he had mentioned before that he would teach him to use his brain. For that reason, there was no basic way to learn. Soon after, the scene cuts to the dungeon where Hong was, and he apparently seemed to be battling that monster. Many hunters underestimated that dungeon just because the monsters there were mermaids. And despite the fact that no survivor had left that dungeon in 3 years, as a result, the mermaids devoured the hunters endlessly. That's why he wondered if there were rules that could block the voices of those mermaids, because initially his goal was to research. However, the protagonist ended up helping to make things more convenient. Thus, almost a whole year had passed since he couldn't make investments due to the school incident. Moreover, he couldn't ignore the government's pressure any longer at that point. When the entire incident was resolved, he would like to take some time to deal with them, because 30 years old is the perfect age for a hunter's talent to bloom. Soon after, a monster tries to attack Hong. He manages to defend against the attack. As a consequence, the man jumps, managing to land a hit on that mermaid. His companion, in turn, seems to have gotten angry. However, Kim was also there. Thus, she ends up being struck by that mermaid. At the same moment, the scene cuts back to Jai, who says that up until that moment, they had been taking turns. That's why they should do things differently that day. He asks them to listen to the situation, and everyone is free to suggest good strategies. That was a dungeon that was about to break, and the priority was to clear it as quickly as possible. The monsters that appeared in the dungeon were pixies. After passing through the gate, there was a plain where they could see a distant forest located less than 10 kilometers away. Hugo, in turn, asks if by chance he could know the dungeon's location. Jai replies no, because the exploration of that dungeon hadn't been conducted the right way. That's why he didn't see a core or even the monsters. Moreover, there was no cover because the moment they reached the dungeon, all the monsters inhabiting it were aware of their location. The girl asks what the weather was like, and Jay replies that it was sunny. The girl becomes thoughtful about that, saying that they might have to light a fire near that place, because those monsters left their territories instead of being cautious. Furthermore, they had enough intelligence to avoid traps and ambushes. Thus, they could set the place on fire with magic, and the monsters wouldn't be able to escape with their poor mobility in the air. The rest of the team, so as not to get burned, could leave the dungeon for a bit and then return. Hearing the girl's explanation, the protagonist remains silent. She asks if something was wrong. Jazz soon after grabs a sticker and places it on the girl's forehead, saying she had done a great job. Looking to the side, Jay ends up noticing something, because Kim's car was in front of the window. Soon after, the protagonist leaves the room. The girl, apparently injured, asks Jay to take her to the hospital. The boy asks if the raid had failed, and Kim replies that they had succeeded. However, something had happened to Hong. In disbelief, the protagonist thinks that was impossible. Apologizing, Jay says he would have to leave urgently. For that reason, he should take care of the students for the rest of the day. Then the scene cuts to Ja already inside the car, thinking there was no way the director could have trouble fighting some mermaids. The girl asked to let her say that in advance, stating that she had opposed it, wondering what kind of person that man was and why he would never work with him again. Moreover, he was full of himself. Jaya, nervous, questions what the problem was, and wants to know why they were heading to the hospital. Kim, in turn, stays silent, saying she needed to check the time, stating that they should have already started, so she needed to check her phone. Looking at his phone, the guy seems to be analyzing the details of the raid. He says that the Sion Guild would release them, and there were no fatalities because the hunters were transferred to the hospital for treatment. Then the scene cuts to the hospital, and our boy seems surprised by something, noticing that Hong was badly injured. He says he thought Hong would have shed at least one tear knowing his situation. Additionally, he knew it was more dangerous for the kids to discover the truth. Because of that, he didn't fake it properly. Recently, he had attacked some of his branches. For that reason, the arc was low and was trying to stay under the radar. Jae in turn asks if it was because he wanted to fake his injuries and observe his movements. Hong replies that it was exactly that. Kim, surprised, asks how he was okay since she had seen him being hit by multiple projectiles, because she had said those injuries were fake, and Hong responds that it was siren blood, although he had taken a very big hit. Then Kim says she made a mistake, because she was nervous as it had been a while since her last raid and she did manage, so she didn't even notice a siren approaching. The protagonist asks why she was so frustrated on the way there. The girl seems unsettled by that, because he said he would need to deceive the students too. Because of that, she only learned of that information when she arrived at the hospital. Thus, the two begin to argue. Returning to the conversation, Hong says they couldn't tell anyone about that. Kim says she would decide after hearing everything. Picking up the artifact, Hong replies that he got it in a dungeon in Mongolia 5 years ago, because it was an item that absorbed the damage it received. However, it was clear that it couldn't absorb damage indefinitely. The total value was fixed at 50, because when it took damage, its name would be engraved proportionally. Right after, Hong says he needed to leave. The scene cuts to him thinking that even after 20 years, only the first letter of Hong's name had been completed on that tag. For that reason, if he had returned that tag earlier and hadn't requested a leave for vacation, Hong probably could have been alive and reached Seoul. Additionally, those 3 letters were the only proof that his director had existed. For that reason, it made him feel his father's death more important than anything. If he had known things would end that way, he would have called him father at least once. He wonders why he never did that. But in the end, he couldn't call them even once. Right after, the scene cuts to someone making a call to the protagonist. He replies that he wasn't the person they were looking for. That voice says that if he didn't pay his debt, they would kill him. However, Jae replies that they had gotten the wrong number. Right after, he ends up hanging up the call. At that moment, he ends up receiving another call from someone. Kim, noticing him, asks if he wasn't going to answer. Jae replies that it seemed like the previous owner of the number was in debt. For that reason, even if he blocked it, they would keep calling from a different number. Right after, Kim grabs the phone. She seems surprised by something. Jae asks why she hung up the call. Kim says that the person they were talking about was from ARC. For that reason, he should make that person come to him first. Jae, surprised, says that Hong's strategy really worked. Kim says it also affected the students, asking what they should do about it. The protagonist says that was something Hong should take care of. Right after, Jae ends up receiving a call, apologizing for calling him, but they didn't think the other person could help, stating that they thought they had awakened. Additionally, they had woken up in a very strange way because they ended up hurting their brother. For that reason, they didn't know what to do in that situation. Jae asks if they could tell him where they were because he would get there as soon as possible, and the boy replies that he would send his address. Right after, he ends up hanging up the call. Kim, surprised, asks if that was really an awakening. The protagonist replies that he was probably hiding his awakening before and had only revealed it at that moment. Observing the location, Kim warns that he was too far, asking if Jae had the license. He asks to obtain one from the Hunters of Daejeon. However, Jae says that he had to show his social connection with none other than the Great Archmage. Shortly after, the girl says she had an idea, because the reason the boy had asked for her help was that he was having trouble controlling his power. For that reason, they should have him enroll in her school, but the protagonist ends up rejecting that offer, because they couldn't invite someone from ARK to their school, and that wasn't an option. Kim, in turn, says that was the most certain way, asking if he hadn't said that his younger brother was with that student. Changing his mind, Jae says they should ask Hong about it. Then the scene cuts to Hong saying that it seemed interesting. Jae says they had already passed the admission period, so it would be a student transfer. Pleased, Kim says they finally seem to be a truly proper school. Next, the scene cuts to the protagonist in his room, seeming to make an announcement, saying he hoped their assignment to create a raid was going well, because they should make sure to submit it by the end of that week. Also, he and Kim would be taking a vacation that day, so the Hunters of Daejeon would accompany them on their way home, stating that he wasn't sure if he'd be there the next day, so they should make sure to work hard. Jae, observing Seo-hyun, notices that she seemed very desperate, asking what the teacher's condition was. The boy replies that he was fine and that was due to his personal matters, so there was no need to worry. Soon after, another girl raises her hand asking if by chance she could attend every day of the week. Jae in turn says she could do as she pleased. Next, the scene cuts to another place in South Korea. Meanwhile, a little boy seemed to be playing with a branch. Soon after, he notices someone. Thus, he stands up. Looking down, he ends up seeing the protagonist's name for some reason. At that moment, he begins to erase it with his foot. Next, the scene cuts to the protagonist's group fleeing from giant lizards, and the boy in the back seat is scared and says he still has a lot to live for. Then, a lizard larger than the others appears in front of the road. Jae in turn asks the girl to bring her rose vines. The girl then uses her power and says that was the best she could do, but the protagonist replies that was already enough. While holding the flowers, the boy thinks about how he ended up in that situation. 2 hours earlier, the group was waiting for Kang's documents. Jae asks the boy if it was still hard to control, and he, in turn, replies that it was better than the first time. The protagonist then explains that the body adjusts after a day. Next, The receptionist asks Kang to turn around so they can take a photo. Kang in turn prepares for the picture. Kim says it seemed true that the boy had just woken up, and the protagonist tells her not to be fooled. The girl asks why the man was being so hard on the young man. Jay thinks that no matter how many times he thought about it, the boy still hadn't fully woken up, and he wonders if he had awakened by coincidence, or if maybe Eric had succeeded in artificial awakening, and he wonders if that's why they dissolved the River of Promise. But he thinks that can't be possible because there was too much change, since he saved the children in Myeongdong, so it shouldn't be to that extent. As they leave the place, the boy holds a slime jar. The protagonist explains that it was a gift for awakening. Then Kang grabs the slime, and it melts in his hand. Jay says that's normal, and explains that it was a slime for the awakened for training purposes, and that until the mana stored in the orbs is depleted, they will stay together when gathered, and one needs to be able to hold them firmly enough so they don't spread. While holding the orbs, the boy says it was very intriguing. Next, Jay asks what Kang was going to do next, because when people his age awaken, they all wish to become hunters. Kim asks if that also happened with the man, but he, in turn, denies it and says he awakened early, and that he also had no interest in becoming a hunter. The girl then wonders how such a person became a hunter. Ja replies that it was the opposite of his expectations and ended up being fun. He then asks if Kang remembered the school he had mentioned, and comments that it was just short of being called a real school and that the director was taking care of it as quickly as possible. Kim mentions that the man would soon be discharged from the hospital, so he shouldn't worry about the rumors, and advises the boy that it was still better than joining some shady guild, and if he was interested, he should call her. After that, Kang looks out the car window and spots people running from something. It is revealed to be giant salamanders. Back in the present, Jay ties the flowers to a post and moves towards the largest salamander, tying a vine around its neck and choking it afterward, making the lizard fall. Inside the car, Kim wonders if everything was okay now. Then Ja lands on the car's hood and ends up scaring his companions. Upon entering the car, the boy informs them that the largest one had disappeared and the smaller ones were blocked. Then he asks Kang how to get to the orphanage from there, and the boy gives instructions. Jay thinks about how strange the situation was, as there was no emergency escape plan for such a situation. When they arrive at the orphanage, Kim uses her ability to block the entrance. Then she asks if the boy thought the big salamander was the boss, but the protagonist says he wasn't sure because it was too small for a boss. As they walk towards the orphanage, Jay finds it odd, because there was a smell of fear coming from inside the orphanage. So he asks Kim to stay outside with the boy. Then he enters the building, coming across a dead person, and he thinks that it wasn't the work of a salamander, as the flesh would have been melted by the venom. As he walks, he sees more dead people, but no children. Jay realizes there were no signs of escape or resistance. Upon opening the daycare door, he finds the bodies of dead children. Then the protagonist leaves the orphanage, saying they should leave, and Kang asks about his siblings. Jay responds that he would tell him later. The boy falls into despair and asks what happened to the teachers and his siblings. And the protagonist thinks that with the orphanage in that state, the connection between number 3 and the Ark would probably weaken. And that if they placed Kang in the model school during this time, it would be easier to monitor him and identify the Ark that contacts him. Then the protagonist falls silent, remembering a conversation he had with Hong. The man asks if the boy hated the director of his orphanage, to which he replies yes. However, his father says that he had done exactly what the director was doing, but says the child wouldn't be like him, so he should become a better person than the director and laugh in his face. Then, Jay bangs his head on the car, thinking that he had always lived with this confidence and that there was no way he could give up. When they reboot, Mizun says that the massacre happened in the afternoon, so most of the children were at school. As for Kang, there were records up until his first year of elementary school, but after starting homeschooling, the details became vague. Hong asks if the suspect list had been narrowed down. The woman says she checked the surveillance cameras, but there was little to obtain. However, in the footage, a hooded person appears, but there were no images of their face even when zooming in. Kim asks how a simple person could have done that. Mizun then plays the security camera footage, which shows the person stretching out their hand toward a car and crushing it with their powers. Then the person enters the orphanage and the footage cuts out. After a while, they come out with clothes stained in blood and point at the camera while smiling. After the footage ends, Kim asks if the person was a serial killer who took advantage of the dungeon breach. Jay says that with that ability, the person could leave no evidence, and he believes the culprit intentionally chose to reveal themselves. Then Hong says he thinks he knows who it is, because that was the person he had been chasing in South America, and that he had heard rumors in the black market. However, they never met, and Jay asks how he was so sure. Hong says that in the rumor, there is a person who turns everything they don't like into a ball to keep as a trophy, and mentions that he had been chasing him because he was the head of the Ark. However, it was just a rumor, so he didn't know the details. Jay says it might be an internal conflict, as the fact that there were no signs of resistance at the scene could also be explained. Mizun says that since no goods or data were stolen, that was the cleanest explanation. Hong then suggests the idea of using bait, because they had Kang, and they were certain he was from RK. He suggests telling the boy that the children were being protected, and that given the situation, he should go to the model school. Even if he wasn't becoming a hunter, he would still need a way to protect himself, and that if ARK came to get him, they would benefit from it. Mission says she liked that plan because they didn't have to lie. She then asks the man if she should investigate more about ARK, but he responds that there was no need, and that if this person is going around killing ARK affiliates, it means other places were in danger. So they needed to find Jay's brother first. The protagonist is confused, but his father explains that this person is going to kill people related to the lab, so his brother must be in danger. Hong and Mizin then start asking questions about the protagonist's brother. 4 years ago at the research center, someone wishes a happy birthday to child number 3 and says they had prepared a cake for him. The boy, in turn, calls the person mother and thanks her. The woman tells him not to call her mother and asks how long he was going to keep acting like a child, and then the boy apologizes. Afterward, the child goes to the infirmary to treat his wounds. The doctor says he endured it well and informs him that he will have visitors later. However, the woman says that visitor might be an inappropriate term for the person. The person was the new director who was arriving. That was the first director the boy had met at that research center. However, he had a bad reputation among the children and researchers, so he didn't last long. The next director, although he was an absent person due to being busy, was careful with the children. A girl approaches the boy asking if it was his birthday, as she had heard from the researchers. The boy replies that yes, and soon they would eat cake together. Right after, the girl gives him cookies as a gift and says she had taken them the day before to give to him. The boy then thanks her. While eating the cookies, the boy shares his gift with the young girl. After that, the boy hears a noise and says it must be the researcher. Then a few people enter the room, saying they like the atmosphere because the children seem so bright. The boy, seeing that, wonders who those people were. And then the executor, the man who killed the first director, enters the room, carrying a child in his arms, who, in turn, asks where they were. His mother says they were at the research center and he would stay there for a while. The boy is happy and asks if he could play with the children, and his mother in turn replies that he would stay there playing while she would take a look around with his father. Then the woman asks what number the boy is. He replies that he is number 3. The mother then asks if he could take care of her son for a while. The boy agrees to do her that favor. After that, number 3 introduces himself and asks what the boy's name is. The boy in turn replies that they couldn't say their names there, so he could report him to his mother. Then he notices the boy had cookies and asks for one. To convince him, he says that if he gives him one, he won't tell his mother. And about the name, he was probably number 12. After the new director arrived, number 3's life at the research center didn't change. Number 12 would go there at snack time and leave at dinner. The other children were wary of him. But when number 12 brought a bunch of toys and food from outside, it soon warmed up to him, and he would always take cookies from number 3. However, everything started to change when the third director died. More children came in, and when number 12's father became the 4th director, it suddenly stopped. Number 12 lost both his parents and started staying with the other children. Kang wonders what will happen to him, and thinks that when he reunited with his sister at the orphanage, he thought the heavens had helped him, and that he never thought he would see her again after graduating from the lab. Even though he could no longer hold her in his arms, she was still as beautiful as ever. However, the heavens took his sister away. Then someone knocks on his room door. It was Jai and his colleagues. The protagonist says they had something important to discuss with him. Kang then invites them in. Hong enters the room and introduces himself to the boy. The young man asks if he was a hunter. Jay says the man was there as the director of the model school, not as a hunter. Then Hong decides to explain the current situation. He tells him that the orphanage was attacked by an unknown stranger. It seems there are some people who want to eliminate the orphanage because of him. The protagonist mentions that they were still investigating the details. After that, he says they wanted to know if the boy had heard anything strange from the teachers. However, Kang says he's not sure about anything. The boy then concludes that his brother didn't die because of the dungeon breach. Hong responds that if he could remember anything, it would help track down the culprit. However, the boy stays silent. Then Jay suggests that he go to his school, as now he was without a home. 2 days later at the model school, the protagonist is with his students and asks who they selected as the raid captain. However, the girl says they haven't decided yet because they believe it's an advanced party. Jay then asks who she had in mind when she wrote that guide. The girl explains that they tried to exclude elemental magic as much as possible and mainly use common magic. But since they were going into a tunnel, she suggested a light attribute mage. After that, the protagonist is surprised by the students' intelligence. Then the young man says the students did a good job and thinks that the fact that a group of teenagers wrote an 80-page guide was something commendable. The students are amazed after hearing that, wondering if they really did a good job. Jia replies that he already told them they did, and then his students are happy, making the protagonist proud. He then decides to give a good job label to everyone. After that, he says that everyone should already know that the director had been discharged from the hospital, and that it may not be exactly the time to celebrate the occasion, but soon they would have a transfer student. One of the girls asks how someone wants to transfer that school. Jia replies that it was still her school, so she shouldn't be so harsh. The girl says she remembers seeing him complaining about the school too. The young man changes the subject and says that Kim would soon arrive with the transfer student, and that he might be younger than the others, but he's in the same grade as them, so they shouldn't tease him. Kang silently observes the scenery in front of him. Shortly after, Kim informs the boy that they had arrived at the school, and looking out the car window, he sees a completely run-down school. Sometime later, the protagonist is introducing Kang to the classroom, saying that he was younger and would be in that class from that day onward, asking if he would like to introduce himself. Then, the nervous boy ends up saying his name. A little later, Jay asks if that was a strawberry smoothie. Kim in turn says yes, saying that everything would be ready soon. Soon after, Jay asks if that was the assistant hunter. The guy saying yes asks if they had met before. Looking at the tag, the boy says that Soonjin made it for him, saying a name was needed to be a barista, asking if Jay wanted anything. The boy then ends up ordering an iced Americano. Then the man asks what the kids like to drink, and the protagonist replies that since it was hot, they would probably prefer smoothies. A little later, Jay is already enjoying his ice cream, thinking that Hong was absent again and had said he was going to a dungeon raid. And at that point, either Lee, the financial supporter, or he, who did all the work, should be the main focus. Looking to the side, he ends up seeing Kang watching the sky. Thus, he hands him a drink, asking how school was going. Kang in turn says he wasn't sure about that, mentioning that the director of his old orphanage had a son, and the two of them used to play together a lot. But honestly, he didn't like him much, because he was extremely annoying and messed with the other kids taking their food. Hearing what the boy was saying, the protagonist seems to realize something, supposing that the young man was probably very irritated because of his past self. Continuing to speak, Kang says that out of nowhere, the director ended up passing away. Even so, he didn't seem well on the outside because the people around made bigger fuss. For that reason, he probably didn't know he would become an orphan because he always had a confident attitude. And while watching that scene, he realized that no one knew what life would bring. Observing the situation, Joe wonders if the boy had perhaps learned that lesson from his misfortune. Even so, he remembered not liking the fact that he had to be pushed, besides the fact that he only had one real father. Kang, continuing to speak, says that compared to that, he had lived quite a peaceful life. That's why he never thought he would awaken. Jay, in turn, asks if perhaps he didn't like the idea of awakening. Kang replies that it would have been better if it had happened in the past, mentioning that he had taken care of Sohee for a long time, planning to live with her once he left the orphanage, and if he had awakened earlier, he could have become a hunter to earn money. However, the girl was no longer there, and there was no reason to become a hunter. Shortly after, the protagonist asks if he didn't want to capture the person who had taken his sister's life, thinking that was all he needed to say to manipulate Kang's emotions and turn them into anger to control him, saying that he should do whatever he wanted to do. Kang had been in a lab since birth, and before entering the school, he had lived a normal life like any other child. Even Jay, who had been born in the lab, dreamed of leaving that place while listening to the boy's stories. However, it was hard to imagine that he wanted that, having had his freedom taken away. Returning to the present, the protagonist says that the most important thing was his will. So if he wanted to become a hunter, Jay would personally help him. But if he didn't want to take that path, that was fine too. Changing the subject, Jay asks if the young man perhaps knew where the director's son was. Kang replies that he didn't know because he had gone somewhere else afterward. Shortly after, another girl appears, asking what was going on, asking why that boy had entered the school instead of her. The protagonist responds that it was because she hadn't graduated high school yet. However, the girl still seemed very upset with the situation. Jag, in turn, thinks it didn't matter since he was already used to that tantrum, asking what she was doing there because she should be in school too. But the girl replies that school wasn't important at the moment. Shortly after, Jay asks Hyun to go get her sister. In a matter of seconds, the girl appears, asking if she hadn't told her not to skip school. Thus, a discussion between the two ensues. Jay, in turn, asks if Kang wanted to take the test. The boy replies that he still didn't know if he really wanted to become a hunter. Then, Jay calls the girl, saying that the model school wasn't an official educational institution yet. For that reason, she would be considered a dropout if she left high school to enroll there. So they should study for one more year because it was better to wait 6 months to get a diploma. Asking if June understood the situation. Hyun, in turn, apologizes and the boy says it was fine, asking her to try saying something nice to her. Shortly after, her sister starts to take Jun away. Ja then says that Kang could now try the test without any problem. It was no big deal, and for that reason, he shouldn't be too nervous. At that moment, the scene cuts to a flashback from our protagonist's past life. Then Hong calls the boy, so Jay wonders if he had done something wrong, thinking that Hong had told him not to touch the items he had brought from the dungeon, supposing he had found out that he played with a coin. Shortly after, Hong points to the protagonist's hand. Then it is revealed that the young man was holding that dungeon coin, so he apologizes for what he did, saying he wouldn't take it without his permission, but Hong replies that he wasn't there to scold him. It was obvious that he couldn't touch the dungeon items without thinking, but he would never take something dangerous home, asking if he understood what he was saying. Moreover, there was only one thing to ask, asking if he remembered when his coin in his hand started glowing, telling the young man to do that again. Then Jay starts to shake the coin. As a result, it disappears. Thus, his hand starts to glow. Hong says it was as expected, as that was mana. At that moment, Hong picks up the coin, asking if he had shown anyone that he could do that, and the young man replies no, that Hong was the first. Then Hong tells him never to show that to anyone, because not everyone was capable of doing that, and if he did it in front of others, they might become envious. Jay says that it was nothing because Hong could also do that, as all he needed to do was gather some particles. Right after, Hong asks if the young man wanted to go for a walk, and the boy replies no. Even so, Hong asks to teach him a few exercises. Thus, the young man ends up accepting the offer. Then the scene cuts to the present, and a protagonist asks if Kang could see that. Handing over the paper, Jay says that if he wasn't seeing anything, it was okay, because he should avoid the drawing being erased, and for that reason, he should place it on the palm of his hand. In the Mana Conductivity Test Manual, the first rule is to activate the auxiliary rune that gathers mana around. Second, the subject of the test was the tester holding one end of the paper. That test infused a small amount of mana. The third rule was for the mana to flow into the tester's hand through the paper to the rune, and finally into the hand of the test subject. Thinking back to when he was 3 years old, long after the coin incident, he realized something different, because no one, not even the man, could make his hand glow like he could. The particles he saw were mana, and he was the only person able to see them with the naked eye. For that reason, this was the pioneering project. The goal of the arc was to awaken people artificially, and it continued for over a decade without any success. Most of the awakened individuals felt nothing more than a tingling in their palms during the test. But for someone like him, an artificially awakened person, it could be different. At that moment, Kang seemed surprised because his hand was glowing, asking if that was really supposed to happen. And thus, the second successful sample of the pioneering project was born, whose name was Kang and was number 13 of the laboratory. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.